She showed up at his door with 3 starving children and a bruise on her jaw that she never explained. He almost turned her away. He almost said no. And if Garrett Rowan had closed that door on that freezing October morning, everything you are about to hear would have ended before it ever began. But the man who almost turned her away was also the man who had just watched his last ranch hand walk off the property with his boots and his bedroll and not a single word of goodbye. So he didn't close the door. And that choice, that one moment of exhausted, desperate, almost accidental mercy, set into motion something neither of them could have survived alone. If you've ever had to choose between pride and survival, between closing a door and opening your life to someone you don't know, stay with me, because this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and leave me a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Roy Hatch walked off the Rowan Ranch, Garrett didn't even try to stop him. He stood on the porch with a cold cup of coffee in his hand and watched the man throw his saddlebag over his horse with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had already made peace with leaving. Roy was 61 years old. He had worked this land since before Garrett's father, Edwin Rowan, could grow a proper beard. He had helped birth calves in February snowstorms. He had dug fence posts in ground so hard it broke 3 iron bars in a single afternoon. He had stayed through drought, through 2 bad winters, through the year the river flooded and took out the south pasture all the way to the tree line. But he couldn't stay through hunger. Roy, Garrett's voice came out flatter than he intended. Not angry, just empty. The old man paused with one boot in the stirrup. He didn't turn around right away. When he did, his face carried something worse than anger. It carried pity. "There's no shame in a man knowing when something's done," Roy said. "It's not done." "Son," Roy's voice dropped low, "there hasn't been a hot meal on this property in 11 days. Your hands are eating cold beans out of a can they're sharing between 2 men. Tom Briggs slept in the barn last night because the bunkhouse stove went out and nobody had the energy to fix it. You can't ask men to work like that." Garrett looked down at the coffee in his hand. It had gone cold an hour ago and he hadn't noticed. "I'll find a cook." "You said that 3 weeks ago." "I'll find one this time." Roy pulled himself up into the saddle with a grunt that told Garrett exactly how much his knees had been hurting in this cold. The old man settled himself, adjusted his hat, and looked down at Garrett with an expression that had nowhere left to go. "Your daddy was a hard man," Roy said, "but he fed his people. He always fed his people. Whatever else Edwin Rowan was, he knew that hungry men can't build anything." He turned his horse and rode down the dirt track toward the road without another word. Garrett stood on that porch for a long time. The ranch spread out in front of him in the thin October light, and what he saw was not the kingdom his father had built. It was the outline of one. The skeleton of it. The fences along the east pasture had 3 sections down, the posts rotted through at the base, and the wire lying flat in the dead grass like something that had given up lying down. The roof on the equipment shed had a hole in it that let in rain, and the rain had been getting into the diesel engine that ran the water pump. And the water pump had been making a sound for 6 days now that Garrett didn't have the mechanical knowledge to diagnose or the money to pay anyone else to diagnose either. 2 more hands had already told him quietly, apologetically, that they were thinking about moving on before winter set in hard. His father had run this operation with 9 men and a full-time cook. Garrett was down to 4 men, no cook, a banknote coming due in 60 days, and a cold cup of coffee he kept forgetting to drink. He was 35 years old, and he felt like he was already losing a war he hadn't chosen to fight. Edwin Rowan had died 14 months ago, fast and without warning, a thing in his chest that the doctor in town called a cardiac event, which was a medical way of saying that the most unbreakable man Garrett had ever known went from standing upright to gone in less than 4 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon in August. No goodbye, no instructions, no moment of final wisdom passed from father to son. Just the foreman's voice on the telephone line saying you need to come home in a tone that told Garrett everything before a single word of explanation followed. Garrett had been working a cattle operation in Wyoming when the call came. He had been trying, in his quiet and somewhat unsuccessful way, to build something of his own separate from his father's name. He had been mostly failing at that too, but it was a smaller and more manageable kind of failure. Then the phone rang, and the life he had been constructing, however imperfectly, collapsed under him, and he came back to Millhaven, Texas, and walked into a ranch that had been running on Edwin's reputation and Edwin's relationships and Edwin's ability to look a banker in the eye without blinking. Garrett did not have his father's eyes. He had his mother's eyes, his father had told him once, not unkindly, but not entirely as a compliment either. His mother had been a woman of warmth and uncertainty, two qualities Edwin Rowan had respected in women and had no patience for in men. The banknote was $60,000, called in against a loan Edwin had taken 3 years ago to buy the eastern section of pasture land when old Duval Hennessy died and his widow put up the acreage. It was good land, the best grazing land the county had, everyone agreed on that, but it was land that needed cattle on it, and the herd had been reduced by 30% after last winter, and what cattle remained weren't yet fat enough to bring the price the loan required. 60 days. Garrett went inside, poured his cold coffee down the drain, and started making a list of everything he needed and everything he had, and trying to find the mathematics that turned one into the other. The mathematics didn't work. He sat at his father's kitchen table, a big scarred oak thing that Edwin had bought at an estate sale 40 years ago and refused to replace because he said it had good bones, and stared at numbers that refused to cooperate. And he thought about Roy Hatch's face, and about Tom Briggs sleeping in the cold barn, and about the fact that 3 of his 4 remaining hands were men who had stayed out of loyalty rather than any reasonable expectation of improvement, and that loyalty had a limit that cold beans and broken stoves were eroding very efficiently. He needed feed costs down. He needed the east fence repaired. He needed the water pump assessed. He needed the roof on the equipment shed before it ruined the engine entirely. He needed to move 15 head to market by the end of the month. He needed someone who could cook. He didn't have money for any of it, except the cattle, and the cattle barely covered the immediate expenses. He put his pen down and pressed both hands flat on the oak table and breathed. His father's kitchen smelled like old wood and machine oil, and faintly, distantly, like the coffee cake Edwin's cook, a woman named Dottie Vance, who had worked here for 22 years, used to make every Sunday morning without fail. Dottie had retired 6 weeks after Edwin died. She had cried at the funeral, quietly and with complete dignity, and then she had gone home to her sister's place in San Antonio, and that had been the end of that. Garrett had not replaced her in 14 months. He had been telling himself he would get to it. He had not gotten to it. This was, he recognized sitting at that table, one of the central failures of his management of the Rowan Ranch. Not the only one, not the largest one financially, but the most consequential in practical terms. Because Dottie had not simply been a woman who made food. She had been the center of gravity around which the daily life of the ranch organized itself. She had known when a hand was getting sick before the man knew it himself. She had kept track of what supplies were running low and told the foreman before they ran out. She had maintained a kind of domestic intelligence about the property that no one had ever formally acknowledged or assigned to her. It had simply existed, the way certain essential things exist, invisibly and completely, until they are gone. Garrett stood up from the table. He put on his coat and his hat, and he went out to fix what he could fix himself, which was not very much, and he tried not to think about Roy Hatch's words on the porch. Your daddy always fed his people. He was mucking out the stall nearest the barn door, doing it himself because Tom Briggs had pulled his back 2 days ago and was moving gingerly. When he heard the sound from the road, not a vehicle, footsteps. He leaned the pitchfork against the stall wall and walked to the barn door and looked out. There was a woman on the road at the edge of his property. She was walking, not riding, not driving, walking, with a bag over one shoulder and a child on each side of her, and another child, the smallest, on her hip. The smallest was sleeping against her shoulder with the total commitment to unconsciousness that only very young children and the truly exhausted can manage. The 2 walking beside her were perhaps 8 and 10 years old, and they were moving with their heads down and their shoulders forward in the particular posture of children who have been walking for longer than children should walk. The woman herself, Garrett put her somewhere around 30, maybe a year or 2 either side, was dressed for weather that was 2 seasons back. Her coat was thin. Her boots were wrong for the terrain. Her hair had come loose from whatever she'd put it in and was blowing sideways across her face, and she didn't push it back because her hands were full. One hand on the child, one hand gripping the bag strap. She was looking at his gate. Then she stopped and looked at the sign that said Rowan Ranch, private property. And then she looked back at the road ahead, and then she looked at the sign again, and Garrett could see from across the distance that she was doing the same mathematics he had been doing at the kitchen table, counting what she had against what she needed and finding the numbers insufficient. She turned and looked directly at the barn door. She had seen him. He stepped out of the shadow of the barn doorway and walked toward the gate. Up close, she was thinner than she had looked from a distance, which was saying something. She had a quality about her face of someone who had been through a sustained ordeal and was refusing to let the ordeal win, which gave her expression a kind of careful steadiness that was either very strong or very brittle, and Garrett couldn't tell which. The bruise along her left jaw was yellow-green, which meant it was a week old, maybe a few days more. He didn't look at it for longer than a second. He looked at her eyes instead, which were gray and direct, and carrying a combination of desperation and pride that made the desperation harder to look at, not easier. "This your ranch?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steadiness. "It is." "You the owner?" "I am." She shifted the child on her hip. The child stirred, muttered something, pressed its face harder into her neck, and went back to sleep. The woman took one breath. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Honest work. I can cook, I can clean, I can manage a house. I can keep records if you need them kept. I'm not asking for much in wages. Just a place for my children to sleep indoors and enough food to keep them fed." She paused. "I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I'm asking for charity wrapped in a job offer. I'm not. I will work harder than any person you have ever employed. I promise you that." She did not explain the bruise. She did not explain where she had come from, or how far she had walked, or what she was running from, because she clearly had the dignity to understand that none of those things were his business until he gave her a reason to trust him with them. Garrett looked at her. He looked at the two children standing on either side of her, watching him with the particular wariness of children who have learned to read the behavior of adults very carefully. The older one, a boy with his mother's gray eyes, had his chin up. The girl, slightly younger, was holding her brother's sleeve without seeming to realize she was doing it. He thought about Roy Hatch riding down the road. He thought about Tom Briggs sleeping in a cold barn. He thought about Dottie's coffee cake and the way the kitchen had smelled on Sunday mornings when the ranch was a place where people wanted to be. He thought about $60,000 and 60 days and the mathematics that didn't work. "Can you really cook?" he asked. "Give me whatever you have in that kitchen," she said, "and I'll show you." He opened the gate. Her name was Abigail Mercer. The boy with the straight chin was named Caleb, and he was 10. The girl holding her brother's sleeve was named May, and she was 8. The child sleeping on Abigail's shoulder, who did not wake up until they were inside the kitchen, and Garrett had put a kettle on the stove, and the warmth of the room had penetrated the child's sleep deeply enough to demand acknowledgement. That child was Henry, and he was 4, and when he finally opened his eyes and looked at Garrett with complete, undefended bewilderment, Garrett felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for immediately. "Hi," Henry said. "Hi," Garrett said back. Henry looked around the kitchen. He looked at the stove. He looked at his mother. He looked back at Garrett. "Do you have food?" Henry asked. "Henry," Abigail said quietly. "It's a fair question," Garrett said. He went to the pantry and opened it. What was in there was not impressive. Half a bag of flour that had been opened too long, 3 onions, a quantity of salt pork that he had not been motivated to cook himself, and that the hands had been eating cold, a few tins of beans, some cornmeal, a jar of dried apples that Dottie had put up the previous fall. Abigail stood in the pantry doorway and looked at what he had. Her face did something complicated, not disappointment exactly, more like a person running rapid internal calculations. And then it settled back into that careful steadiness, and she said, "Can I look in the rest?" She found a partial bag of dried beans he had forgotten about. She found salt and pepper and a tin of lard behind a box. She found 2 jars of Dottie's preserved tomatoes from 18 months ago that were still sealed and still good. She tied her hair back with a piece of string she took from her coat pocket, and she said, "Caleb, May, come here." The children came. "Caleb, you're going to peel those onions, all of them. Don't cry about it." "I don't cry about onions." "You always cry about onions." "I don't always." "May, find me something to stir with. A big spoon. Look in those drawers." The kitchen, which had been silent and dead for weeks, became abruptly and entirely inhabited. Garrett stood near the door for a moment, not quite sure what to do with himself in his own kitchen, and then he thought he should probably go tell the remaining hands that something was happening, that the situation had shifted in a direction that was not yet clearly better, but was at least different, which after 11 days of cold beans felt like it might be close enough to hope to work with. He found Tom Briggs at the bunkhouse, moving carefully around his bad back, and two other hands, Davis Polk and young Wheeler, who was 19 and had been hired on in June and had never been through a Millhaven winter and was starting to look like he was reconsidering the life choices that had brought him here. "There's going to be a hot meal tonight," Garrett said. The three men looked at him. "What kind of hot meal?" Davis asked, with the skepticism of a man who has been disappointed recently in this exact category. "I don't know yet, but it's happening, 6 o'clock. He left before they could ask questions he didn't have answers to. When he came back to the kitchen at 5:30 to see how things were progressing, the smell that met him at the door was one of those smells that does something to a person before the mind catches up with it. Something warm and deep and layered, the smell of onions cooked down slow and salt pork rendered, and beans going soft in a broth that had been built with Dottie's tomatoes, and what Garrett recognized with some confusion as actual complexity of flavor, despite an ingredient list that had no business producing it. Henry was asleep again, curled in the armchair by the stove that Garrett used for reading when he remembered that reading was something he used to do. May had found a broom and was sweeping the kitchen floor with complete concentration, as though this was a task whose importance she understood deeply. Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, and when Garrett looked more closely, he realized the boy was making a list. Column of items, column of numbers. A boy of 10, making an inventory list. "What's that?" Garrett asked. Caleb looked up without particular shyness. "What's in the pantry?" he said. "So we know what we have and what we need." Garrett looked at Abigail, who was at the stove with her back to him and couldn't see his expression. "Good thinking," he said. "Mama says you can't feed people if you don't know what you have," Caleb said, and went back to his list. At 6 o'clock, Garrett brought the four men into the kitchen, Tom moving carefully, Wheeler looking uncertain, Davis with his arms crossed against hope, and Abigail put a Dutch oven on the table with cornbread in a cast-iron pan and a bowl of the preserved tomatoes sliced and dressed, with the last of a bottle of apple cider vinegar Garrett had not known he possessed. And the meal was not beautiful, and it was not fancy, and it was made from the most minimal foundation of resources that anyone could imagine. And it was the best thing Garrett had eaten in so long that he had to stop halfway through and breathe, because the simple act of eating food that tasted like someone had given thought to making it, not just fuel, but actual food prepared by a person who understood what food was for, did something to him that he wasn't expecting. Davis Polk put his spoon down after his third helping, looked at Abigail across the table. "Ma'am," he said, "where did you come from?" "West of here," she said simply. "Well," Davis said, "I hope you're planning on staying for a while." Tom Briggs laughed. It was the first time Garrett had heard Tom laugh in longer than he could remember. Wheeler, who had been silent and eating steadily with the focus of a young man who had been genuinely hungry, looked up from his bowl and said, "Is there more cornbread?" "Yes," Abigail said. "Then I'm not going anywhere," Wheeler said, and that got another laugh from the table, and the kitchen filled with a sound that Garrett had not heard in this house since before his father died, since before Dottie left, since before the slow unraveling had begun. The sound of people at a table, warm and fed, and not alone. Later, after the children were asleep in the room Garrett had shown Abigail, the small bedroom off the kitchen that Dottie had used, vacant these 14 months, and after the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse with something lighter in their steps, Garrett sat at the oak table with a cup of coffee that was actually hot for once, and he went through the numbers again. They still didn't work. The banknote was still $60,000. The fences were still down. Roy Hatch was still gone down that road and not coming back. But somewhere in the house a child was sleeping in a warm room, and tomorrow morning Garrett was willing to bet there would be something hot on that stove before dawn. He put the numbers away and went to bed and slept, for the first time in weeks, without waking up in the middle of the night with his chest tight and his mind already calculating. That was the first day. He did not yet understand what kind of change had walked through his gate, but the ranch, the old, battered, struggling, almost gone ranch that had been Edwin Rowan's life and was now Garrett's burden and his inheritance both, had registered the difference already in the way that properties sometimes do before the people living in them have the presence of mind to notice. Something had shifted. Something had begun. And 60 days was still 60 days, and the bank was still the bank, and the world outside that gate had not changed a single degree in anyone's favor. But the kitchen light had been on until 9 o'clock, and the smell of onions and salt pork still hung in the air of the house. And Henry Mercer had said, "Do you have food?" with the directness of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned to be ashamed of what he needs. And Garrett Rowan, for the first time since his father's death, felt like maybe, he was not entirely alone in trying to save the thing his father had built. He was wrong about how simple that would turn out to be. He was also not wrong about the feeling. Both things were true. They usually are. The morning after the first meal, Garrett woke before 5 to the sound of something he hadn't heard in this house in over a year. The stove was going. He lay in his bed for a moment, listening to the faint clank of iron and the low, steady hiss of the kettle and the sound of someone moving quietly in the kitchen with the particular kind of quietness that is not absence of sound, but rather consideration for the sleeping, a deliberate, practiced softness. He got up and pulled on his pants and his boots without fully processing why he felt something different in his chest this morning, something that wasn't quite relief, but was in the same neighborhood of it. When he came into the kitchen, Abigail was at the stove with her back to him, and she had already found where Dottie had kept the cast-iron skillet and the big pot. And she had already built something out of the leftover salt pork and the cornmeal and dried apples that smelled. He stopped in the doorway, like an actual breakfast. She didn't turn around. "Coffee's on the back burner," she said. "Cups are where they were yesterday." He poured himself a cup and stood for a moment in his own kitchen, feeling like a guest. "You didn't have to start this early," he said. "The men need to eat before they work." She turned the heat under the skillet. "What time do they start?" 6. "Then I need to start at 4:30. She said it without any particular emphasis, as though this were simply arithmetic. "Do you have more lard anywhere? I used what was in the tin. There might be some in the cellar. I'll need you to check today. And the flour bag you have. It's on its way out. It'll be fine for another few days if I keep it dry, but it needs to be used first before the new." "I'll put it on the list." She glanced at him over her shoulder for the first time. "Caleb already has a list." Garrett thought about the 10-year-old at the table with his paper and pencil. "I know," he said. She turned back to the stove. Something shifted in the set of her shoulders. Not relaxation exactly, but an adjustment, like a person who has been prepared for resistance and found the footing under them slightly more stable than expected. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. They occupied the kitchen in the early dark with the stove heat between them and the coffee, and the sound of the house waking up around them. And it wasn't comfortable exactly. There was too much unknown between two strangers for comfort. But it wasn't bad either. At 5:50, Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway fully dressed with his boots on and his list in his hand. "Mama," he said, "we're out of baking powder." "I know. That's going to be a problem for bread." "I know that too." He looked at his list. "We also need—" "Caleb," she pointed at the table. "Sit down and eat your breakfast. The list will wait." He sat down, but he kept the list in his hand. Garrett watched him and thought about his own father, who had also eaten breakfast with his priorities already organized in his head before the food hit the table. It was a particular type of person, Garrett had always thought. Not ambitious exactly, but fundamentally incapable of being unaware of what needed doing. Edwin had been that way. It was exhausting to live with and extraordinarily useful to have around. May came in quieter, sat beside her brother, and watched Garrett with the careful attention she had been watching him with since they arrived. She wasn't unfriendly. She was assessing. There was a difference. Henry came in last, still half asleep, walked directly to his mother, put his forehead against her leg without a word, and stood there like a small tree requiring stability until she put her hand briefly on the back of his head, and he unmoored himself and climbed into a chair. "Hi," Henry said to Garrett when he finally focused. "Morning," Garrett said. "Is there eggs?" "No chickens," Garrett said. Henry absorbed this information. "Why not?" "Haven't gotten around to it." Henry looked at him with an expression of patient incomprehension, as though the concept of not having chickens was a gap in logic he was willing to let pass for now, but intended to return to. At 6 o'clock, when Davis Polk opened the bunkhouse door expecting nothing in particular, expecting cold air and another morning of making do, the smell came to him from across the yard, and he stopped dead in the doorway and just stood there for a moment with his hand on the door frame. "What is that?" Wheeler said from behind him. "That," Davis said, "is breakfast." Tom Briggs, who had been moving carefully around his back all morning, moved considerably less carefully, getting his coat on. They came into the kitchen and Abigail fed them. Cornmeal porridge with the dried apples cooked through it, and a sweetness from a jar of sorghum she had found at the back of the pantry shelf that nobody remembered putting there, salt pork on the side, coffee that was hot and strong and plentiful. The men ate without much conversation, the way men do when they are genuinely hungry and the food is genuinely good, which is a different kind of silence than the silence of men who have nothing to say. Wheeler ate 2 full bowls. "Son," Davis said, "slow down before you hurt yourself." "I haven't had a hot breakfast since—" Wheeler thought about it. "September," he said. "It's October," Tom said. "I know when it is." Abigail moved around the kitchen while they ate, already thinking forward. Garrett could see it in the way she was looking at the pantry door, calculating. She refilled coffee cups without being asked. She caught Henry before he put his elbow in Davis's bowl without breaking stride. When the men pushed back from the table to go to work, Davis paused at the door. "Ma'am," he said, same as the night before. He nodded at her. It was a particular kind of nod that Garrett recognized, the kind a man gives when words aren't adequate to what he's trying to communicate, but he wants the communication to land anyway. Abigail nodded back. After they were gone, the kitchen had that particular stillness of a room that has just held more people than usual and is readjusting to the quiet. Henry had fallen back asleep in the armchair. May had found a rag and was wiping down the table without being asked, which made Garrett look twice. Caleb had his list out again. "We need chickens," Caleb said. "We do," Garrett said. "And baking powder." "I'll go into town today." Caleb looked at him with the same directness his mother had. "We need a lot of things," he said. He held out the list. Garrett took it. It was written in a child's careful handwriting, but the items on it were not a child's items. They were the items of someone who had been thinking about how to feed people through a winter. Flour, baking powder, lard, dried beans, cornmeal, salt, sugar, coffee, canned tomatoes, dried fruit, fatback, rice. And underneath that, in slightly different handwriting that was smaller and more deliberate, fence wire, east section visible from road, 3 posts broken at base. Garrett looked up from the list. "The fence wire," he said. "You walked past the east pasture?" "When we came up the road," Caleb said. "I noticed." Garrett folded the list, put it in his coat pocket. "You notice a lot. Mama says there's no point in looking if you're not going to see." Garrett went to town. Millhaven was not a large place. A main street with a general store and a feed store and a bank and a doctor's office and a church and a barber shop and a diner called Nellie's that had been called Nellie's since before anyone currently alive could remember and had never actually been owned by anyone named Nellie. Garrett did his business at the general store, bought what the list demanded, spent more than he was comfortable spending, put it on his account with the understanding that the cattle he was moving to market at the end of the month would settle it. He loaded the wagon. He was tying down the last of the flour sacks when he heard his name. Garrett Rowan. He turned. Frank Cutter was standing on the boardwalk in front of the feed store with his thumbs in his belt loops and an expression on his face that Garrett had been seeing on Frank Cutter's face his entire life. The particular expression of a man who has information he considers leverage. Frank was 58, owned the largest spread east of the county line, had been trying to buy Rowan land since Edwin's first bad year a decade ago, and had never once made an offer that was anything other than significantly below what the land was worth. "Frank," Garrett said. "Heard you had some people come onto your property," Frank said. Garrett looked at him. "Word travels." "Small town." Frank shrugged with the elaborate casualness of someone who has arranged the shrug in advance. "Woman and some children, I heard. Walking. That's right. You know anything about where she came from?" "She's working for me," Garrett said. "That's what I know." Frank looked down the street and back. "Your daddy would have been more careful about who he let through his gate." Garrett untied the rope, retied it tighter, and climbed up onto the wagon seat. He looked down at Frank Cutter from that small elevation. "My daddy," he said, "would have told you to mind your own business in a way that was a lot less polite than I'm about to." He drove out of town before Frank could arrange a response. The drive back was 40 minutes on a road that was not kind to wagon wheels, and Garrett spent it thinking about Frank Cutter's face and what it meant that the man already knew about Abigail and the children. Small town, Frank had said, which was true, which meant that whatever Garrett did or did not do next, people were already watching and already forming opinions, and small-town opinions about a widow woman living under a bachelor's roof had a particular shape that Garrett knew from a lifetime of living inside this geography, and that shape was not charitable. He told himself it didn't matter. He was mostly convincing. When he got back to the ranch, the east fence was being repaired. He sat for a moment with the reins in his hands and looked at the scene and processed it. Davis and Wheeler were working the fence line, new posts going in, wire being strung, but the person directing the operation, standing at the nearest broken section with her arms crossed and pointing at something in the post hole, was Abigail Mercer. Beside her, Caleb was holding the fence post upright while Davis packed the earth around the base. Garrett climbed down from the wagon. "What happened?" he said when he got close enough. Davis looked up. She came out and asked what needed fixing most. "I told him," Garrett said, "that the water pump needs parts you don't have," Abigail said, not unkindly. "The fence needs wire you do have. And if your cattle get through a broken fence and onto the road, you've got a much bigger problem than a pump." She looked at him steadily. I asked Davis what was most urgent in practical terms. This was his answer. Garrett opened his mouth and then closed it. "The groceries are in the wagon," he said. "I'll get May to help bring them in." She turned back to the fence. Caleb was watching his mother with an expression of complete unself-conscious admiration that Garrett thought the boy was probably not aware of wearing. Davis was packing the post base. Wheeler was stringing wire at the next section down with focused efficiency that Garrett had not seen from Wheeler in about 3 weeks. Garrett went to unload the wagon. He thought about what Roy Hatch had said. Your daddy always fed his people. He thought about how he had always understood that to mean literally food, sustenance, the basic maintenance of the people who worked the land. But watching Davis move with a kind of purpose he hadn't had last week, watching Wheeler work like he had a reason to, he started to understand that Edwin Rowan's cooking had never been only about the food. It had been about what the food meant. It had been about someone in that kitchen thinking ahead, managing the daily intelligence of the operation, doing the invisible work of keeping people oriented toward the place they lived rather than toward the road that led away from it. He had lost that 14 months ago and hadn't understood what he'd lost until it walked back through his gate on a cold October morning carrying a sleeping 4-year-old and a bag that wasn't heavy enough. He carried flour sacks into the kitchen, and May met him at the door and took the smaller items without being asked and organized them on the counter by category, which he noticed because it was not what he would have done. "Your brother writes lists," he said. "Do you do that too?" "I remember things," May said. She picked up the baking powder and looked at it. "We were almost out." "I know. I told Caleb," she said. She put the baking powder on the shelf in exactly the right place, and Garrett thought that in this family, it was very possible that Caleb was not actually the one in charge of the information. That afternoon, the weather shifted. Not to winter yet, but toward it. The sky going that particular shade of gray-white that meant intention, that meant the season was making a decision. The temperature dropped 12 degrees between noon and 3 o'clock, and the wind that came out of the northwest had edges on it. Garrett found himself checking the bunkhouse stove. It had been fixed 2 days ago. Davis had gotten the part from somewhere he didn't explain. And checking the fuel supply and checking the roof on the equipment shed, where the hole was still there, but he'd put a tarp over it that was holding for now. He moved through the property doing the accounting that ranchers do when weather threatens. The mental checklist of every vulnerability, everything that could go wrong with cold and wind, every animal and structure and supply that needed to be in a particular condition before winter arrived in earnest. He came back to the kitchen at 5 o'clock to find Caleb sitting with Davis Polk at the table. They were looking at the list together. Davis had a pencil and was adding things. "What are you doing?" Garrett said. Davis looked up without embarrassment. "Kid knows his supply list. I'm adding what's low in the bunkhouse." Garrett looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him with the expression of someone whose methodology has been recognized as sound and who is not surprised by this. "Okay," Garrett said, because he didn't know what else to say. Dinner that night was something Abigail called a stew, but what it actually was the organized transformation of available materials into something that should not have been as good as it was. She had taken the dried beans, soaked since that morning, and combined them with the canned tomatoes and onions, and a quantity of the salt pork, and something she had done with dried herbs she had found in a tin in the back of the pantry that Garrett hadn't known were there. And the result was a pot of food that smelled like something a person would make on purpose, not something assembled from limitation. She had also baked bread. Real bread. Not cornbread, actual risen bread, with the new flour and the baking powder from town, shaped into 2 loaves that had come out of the oven while Garrett was checking the bunkhouse, and were sitting on the counter cooling when he came back. And the smell of them, warm and yeasty and fundamental, hit him in the chest in a way that was not dramatic and was entirely involuntary. Wheeler picked up a loaf and just held it for a second before he cut it. "I cannot tell you," he said to no one in particular, "how much I have missed bread." "You're from Kansas," Davis said. "Your mother made bread." "She did," Wheeler said. He cut himself a thick slice and held it. "Yeah, she did." He ate it standing up, before he even sat down at the table, and he did it without any apparent self-consciousness, and nobody said anything about it because they all understood exactly what he was experiencing, which was the particular comfort of a specific food reconnecting a person to a time when things were simpler than they had since become. Henry sat at the table with his piece of bread held in both hands, and his eyes completely closed, eating with the total concentration of a small person for whom this was not nostalgia but present-tense revelation. He was 4 years old, and bread was bread, and bread was what was happening right now, which was all that needed to be true. May ate properly with her spoon and watched everyone else. Abigail sat at the corner of the table and ate her own food, and she was thin enough that Garrett noticed she served herself less than everyone else, and he said nothing about it that night, but he thought about it. Later, after the children were in bed and the hands were back at the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was quiet again, Garrett came in from a last check of the property and found Abigail at the kitchen table with Caleb's list spread out in front of her and a second piece of paper beside it where she was making calculations in the margins. "You should eat more," he said. She didn't look up. "I eat enough." "You gave your portion to Henry at dinner." A pause. "I gave him a little extra," she said. "He's growing." "You're not growing, but you're also not eating enough." She looked up then. Her expression was not angry. It was measured in the way she had of managing herself in front of someone she didn't fully trust yet, which was a way Garrett was beginning to recognize as something she had learned rather than something she had always needed. "Mr. Rowan," she said, "I have been managing what my children and I eat for a long time. I appreciate the concern, but add yourself to the grocery list," he said. "Whatever makes up the difference between what you're eating and what you need, add it." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was more like the careful acknowledgement of someone filing away a data point. This person, this action, what it means. She had a way of receiving kindness that was not warm and not cold, but was watchful, as though she were still determining whether what looked like kindness would remain kind under pressure or would present a bill later. He understood that was not something she had come to on her own. He understood it had been taught to her by someone who had made the teaching necessary. He didn't push it. He went to bed. The next morning, he woke up to the stove going again, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. By the end of the second week, something had happened to the rhythm of the ranch that Garrett would have had trouble explaining to anyone who hadn't watched it occur. The men were working differently. Not harder exactly, but with more continuity. Davis had started repairing the tack room on his own initiative, a project he'd mentioned once in September and then set aside. Wheeler had asked Garrett where the extra fence wire was stored, not because he'd been assigned a fence project, but because he'd seen the section down near the creek and wanted to fix it before the weather got worse. Tom Briggs had rehung the equipment shed door that had been sticking and was keeping heat in much better. These were things Garrett had needed done for months. They were getting done now not because he had asked or assigned or scheduled. They were getting done because the men were fed and warm, and something about the kitchen being alive again had recalibrated the whole property's sense of what was possible. Caleb had attached himself to Tom Briggs. This had happened gradually and without announcement. Tom was the oldest hand remaining, and he moved carefully around his bad back, and he had a kind of quiet seriousness about him that apparently suited Caleb, who was himself quiet and serious in a way that seemed older than 10. Garrett had started noticing them together, Caleb helping Tom move a beam that the older man couldn't manage on his own, Caleb handing tools, watching with that focused attention he gave to anything that seemed worth understanding. "That boy's going to be handy," Tom told Garrett one morning, low so Caleb wouldn't hear. "His mother's handy," Garrett said. "Different kind of handy," Tom said. "She sees what needs doing and does it. He sees why things work the way they do. That's a rarer thing." Garrett watched Caleb examining the joint on a gate hinge with the concentration of a person who intends to understand exactly what has failed and why. And he thought Tom was right. May had found the garden. It was Dottie's garden, really. A kitchen garden behind the house that had gone completely to seed and weeds since Dottie left. A rectangular plot that had been producing tomatoes and squash and beans and peppers every summer for 2 decades, and was now just a tangle of dead plants and overgrown grass. May had found it the second day and had been spending time there with focused, methodical attention that was, Garrett thought when he first noticed it, either extremely productive or completely futile given the time of year. "Nothing's going to grow until spring," he told her. May looked at him with the patient expression of someone tolerating an interruption. "I know that. I'm clearing it. It'll freeze and need clearing again." "It'll be half cleared," May said, "instead of all the way not cleared. In spring, that matters." He left her to it. The change in Henry was the most visible and the most uncomplicated. Henry was 4, and 4-year-olds do not have the architecture of self-protection that older people develop around unfamiliar kindness. Henry had arrived exhausted and hungry and had slept most of the first day, and by the 3rd day he was awake and curious, and had identified every person on the property by name, and had a relationship with each of them calibrated to something he had observed about each person's particular nature. With Wheeler, he was boisterous, matching the young hand's easy energy. With Tom, he was quieter, sitting near the older man without necessarily talking. With Davis, he had developed a specific dynamic in which Henry made pronouncements, and Davis responded to them with complete seriousness regardless of content. "That cloud," Henry said one afternoon, pointing, "is shaped like a boot." Davis studied it. "More like a hat." Henry looked again. "Both," he decided. "Fair," Davis said. With Garrett, Henry was different. He watched Garrett the way his sister did, but without May's calculation. It was simpler, more immediate. He would simply appear near Garrett sometimes, not demanding anything, not asking, just present. Garrett would be checking the water pressure at the pump housing and look down, and Henry would be standing there watching him with his hands in his pockets and his chin up. "What are you doing?" Henry would ask. "Checking the pump." "Why?" "Because it needs to be checked." "Why?" And so on. Garrett had never spent time around a 4-year-old before and had not anticipated the specific texture of it. The way Henry's questions were not really questions, but were more like a running engagement with the world's ongoing strangeness. Each why not a demand for information, but an invitation to keep talking, to keep the connection of the moment from ending. He found himself answering more carefully than he needed to. At the end of the 2nd week, Garrett sat at his father's oak table with the ranch's account book open and went through the numbers again. The east fence was repaired. The equipment shed roof was still holding with the tarp, and Davis had found a contact for roofing tin at a price Garrett could almost manage. The water pump was still making its noise but was functional. He had 15 head ready to move to market, probably by the end of next week if the weather held, and what they brought in would go directly against the banknote, which would get the balance down to something still large but marginally less terrifying. He was not going to make 60 days without the cattle sale, but he might, barely, with the kind of barely that required everything to go right, make 60 days with it. He turned the page in the account book and wrote down what he had spent on groceries and what Abigail's wages were and what the fence wire had cost. And for a moment the numbers made his stomach tighten the way they always did. The familiar contraction of a man trying to hold too many liabilities in his hands at once. Then he looked at the column next to it, the one for labor costs, and he looked at what it had been 3 weeks ago when he was down to 4 men and losing more, and what it was now with those same 4 men, and the specific difference in what was getting done each day. The gap between the two was not a number he knew how to put in the column. He couldn't quantify what a hot breakfast was worth in terms of fencing completed. He couldn't put a dollar figure on the fact that Davis had started a repair on his own initiative that would have required a full day of paid work to assign and supervise. He couldn't calculate what it meant that Wheeler had decided to stay. But he could see the result of it laid out in the account book, in the difference between what was getting done now and what had been getting done before. And he sat back in his father's chair and looked at the ceiling of his father's kitchen and tried to think of how a man in his position put words around what a woman with a bag over her shoulder and 3 hungry children had done to his ranch in 2 weeks. He didn't have the words yet. He heard Henry laugh from the other room. A sudden, complete, full-volume laugh at something May had said, the kind of laugh a child makes when they are entirely unguarded. And Garrett listened to it in the quiet kitchen and thought that whatever the mathematics were, he was looking at the wrong column. The banknote was still real. The fences still needed work. Winter was still coming. But something had happened here that Garrett understood was not reversible. The ranch had remembered what it was for. Not for land accumulation. Not for Edwin Rowan's legacy. Not for banknotes and cattle markets and the opinions of Frank Cutter. For people. For the daily business of keeping people warm and fed and connected to each other and to the place they inhabited. Abigail Mercer had walked in with nothing and had reminded him of everything, and he didn't know what to do with that yet. Not really. Not in any way he could act on. But he knew it. He closed the account book and went to see if there was anything left of dinner. There was. She had left a bowl covered with a plate on the back of the stove where it would stay warm without being asked, because she had noticed he sometimes came in late and had started doing this sometime in the middle of the second week without saying anything about it. He sat at the table and ate, and outside the wind was picking up, and somewhere in the house 3 children were asleep, and his 4 remaining hands were in a warm bunkhouse, and the kitchen smelled like bread and coffee and the particular domestic warmth of a place that has been properly inhabited. He was not a man given to easy feeling. He had grown up in Edwin Rowan's house, where feeling was a private matter and sentiment was something you kept to yourself. But sitting there alone in the kitchen with the wind outside and the warmth inside, he felt something that he understood was important and that he could not yet name, and that scared him a little, for exactly that reason. He finished his bowl and washed it and put it away and went to bed. Outside, the first real cold of the season was settling across the Texas plains, and somewhere east of town, Frank Cutter was talking to someone about the widow on the Rowan Ranch, and 60 days was down to 43, and none of that had changed. But the ranch hands didn't know that from inside a warm bunkhouse, and the children didn't know it from inside a warm room, and Garrett Rowan was learning, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that people learn the things they most need to learn, that there are some problems that numbers cannot solve, and some kinds of repair that no account book has a column for. The cattle sale went through on a Thursday. Garrett drove 15 head to the Millhaven stockyard in weather that couldn't decide between rain and sleet, stood in the cold for 3 hours while the buyers walked the animals and argued prices with each other, and came away with a number that was not what he'd hoped and was better than he'd feared. He drove back with the check folded in his breast pocket and stopped at the bank before it closed and put $31,000 against the note, which reduced the balance to $29,000 and gave him, according to the bank officer, a thin, careful man named Gerald Pruitt who wore the same brown suit every time Garrett had ever seen him, approximately 90 additional days before the next critical threshold. 90 days. It was not salvation, it was a slightly longer fall. But Garrett drove back to the ranch in the sleet with something he hadn't had in weeks, which was a horizon he could see to. Not the end of the problem was still the problem, but enough distance ahead that he could breathe while he looked at it. He came home to the smell of something baking. He had stopped being surprised by this. He had started, instead, anticipating it, the particular way the ranch house smelled now when he came back from any errand of more than an hour, the warmth of it meeting him before he even got through the door. He had started to understand that this was what Dottie had given the ranch for 22 years, and that he had let it disappear without realizing what it was. He told Abigail about the banknote at dinner because she had a right to know the status of the place she was working, and because Caleb's supply lists and May's garden clearing and the general intelligence of the household operation she was running had become so integrated with the ranch's functioning that it seemed wrong to keep her in the dark about the larger situation. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "So we have 90 days, she said. "I have 90 days, he said, and then heard how that sounded. "I mean, No, she said. You're right. It's your ranch. She looked at her coffee cup. But the garden will start producing in March if I can get the soil turned before the freeze sets in. That reduces food costs by a real amount starting in spring. March is after 90 days. Spring cattle will bring better prices than fall. You know that. I need the spring herd to be bigger than the fall herd, and right now, what's the minimum head count you need to make the next payment? He looked at her across the table. You don't have to. What's the number, Mr. Rowan? He told her. She looked at the middle distance for a moment the way Caleb did when he was running calculations, and Garrett thought again about the family resemblance in this. Not physical, but procedural. The way they all moved toward problems with the same practical directness. That's manageable, she said. It's manageable if nothing goes wrong, he said. Everything always goes wrong, she said. You plan for what you can and you deal with what you can't. She picked up her coffee cup. The water pump is going to be the first thing that breaks. She was right about that. The pump went 3 days later on a Sunday morning with a grinding noise that everyone on the property heard from wherever they were standing. What followed was 2 days of Garrett driving to 3 different towns looking for the right part, while Abigail organized a water-carrying operation using every available container on the property, buckets, barrels, the big galvanized tub from the laundry, anything that held water, so that the animals didn't suffer and the household didn't stop functioning. She did this without complaint and without drama, moving from task to task with the same steady competence she brought to everything. And when Garrett came back on the second day with the right part and fixed the pump by lamplight with Davis holding the light and his hands numb from cold, he came inside to find hot water already on the stove and Abigail sitting at the table looking tired in a way she didn't usually let show. You should sleep, he said. I will. She didn't move immediately. Did you eat anything today? I ate. What did you eat? He thought about it. Biscuit, this morning. She got up and went to the stove without a word and heated what was left of dinner and put it in front of him and sat back down. And they sat in the kitchen at 10 o'clock at night with the pump fixed and the water running again and the wind outside, and neither of them said much. And Garrett thought about how there were kinds of partnership that didn't have names for themselves, and that this, whatever this was, had become one of them without either of them deciding it would. It was the Thursday of the following week that things cracked. Garrett was in town for feed when he ran into Nora Hendricks outside the general store. Nora was 64, had lived in Millhaven her entire life, was the wife of the county assessor, and had what Garrett's father had once described as the particular gift of a woman who turns community concern into personal currency. She stopped him on the boardwalk with a hand on his arm and a smile that was warm on the surface and did not go any deeper than the surface. Garrett, she said, I'm glad I caught you. I've been wanting to speak with you. Nora. He tipped his hat. I hear you have a woman staying at the ranch. I have a cook, he said. Well, yes, but... She lowered her voice in the way people do when they want the lowering to be noticed. She's living on the property with her children, and you're there alone, Garrett. No other women on the property. I have 4 ranch hands. Yes, but they're men. She said this as though it resolved the point rather than restating it. People are talking. I'm only telling you because I care about your family's reputation. Your father built something here. People in this town respected Edwin Rowan. What exactly are people saying? His voice was level. He had learned level from his father, who had been capable of a quietness that was louder than other men shouting. Nora's smile adjusted slightly. Just that it looks improper. A widow, no husband, living under a single man's roof. Her situation is obviously difficult, but perhaps there are other arrangements. The Women's Society has resources for... She works for me, Garrett said. She cooks for my ranch hands and manages the household. That's the arrangement. Garrett, I'm not suggesting anything improper has occurred. I'm saying how it looks. Nora, he said, I appreciate your concern. He picked up his feed sacks. Give my regards to your husband. He drove back to the ranch with his jaw tight. He didn't tell Abigail that day. He told himself it was because there was nothing to tell. It was gossip. It was Nora Hendricks being Nora Hendricks. It was the particular cruelty of small towns that dress themselves up as concern. He told himself it would blow over. He was still telling himself that 4 days later when Frank Cutter rode up the drive. Garrett saw him coming from the barn and walked out to meet him before he could get to the house, which was deliberate. Frank pulled up at the gate and looked down at Garrett from his horse with the expression of a man doing something unpleasant for someone else's benefit. "Garrett," he said. "Frank." Garrett did not open the gate. "I'll say this plainly because I think you deserve plain talk." Frank settled his weight in the saddle. "There are people in this town who think what you've got going on here is unseemly. A woman of no known background, no local family, no husband, living here. Town's been talking for 2 weeks. I know what the town's been talking about. Then you know it's becoming a problem." "For who?" Frank's expression shifted. "For the bank, Garrett. Gerald Pruitt is not the only person who sits on that loan committee. There are men on that committee who are also husbands and fathers and members of this community, and when something makes the community uncomfortable—" "Are you telling me," Garrett said, and his voice had gone very quiet, "that the bank is considering the condition of my loan based on who I employ?" "I'm telling you what people are saying." "What people?" "You. Not just me." "Name someone else." Frank looked at him. "I'm trying to help you." "No," Garrett said, "you're not. You've been trying to buy this land since my father's first bad year, and you have never once offered what it's worth. And you have never once come onto this property without an agenda that served Frank Cutter first and everyone else nowhere." He kept his voice steady. "It cost him something to do it. If you have a concern about my loan, you can put it in writing to Gerald Pruitt. Otherwise, I'd ask you to get off my property." Frank looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse without another word and rode back down the drive, and Garrett stood at the gate and watched him go and felt the particular cold of knowing that the conversation was not over. It was only going to change locations. He went inside. Abigail was at the stove. She turned when he came in and read his face the way she had gotten good at reading it over these weeks. Quickly, accurately, without asking directly what she was reading. "What happened?" she said. He told her. All of it. Nora Hendricks and Frank Cutter and the bank committee and what Frank had implied. He told her because she deserved to know and because he was tired of managing information about a situation that directly affected her, and because he had started to understand that managing information around Abigail Mercer was both pointless and disrespectful, as she had a stronger grasp of most situations than she was ever given credit for. She listened the way she always listened. Still, watching him, her hands stopped in whatever they had been doing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How serious is the bank committee concerned?" she asked. Frank could be exaggerating. But he might not be. He might not be. She turned back to the stove. Her shoulders were doing the thing they did when she was working something out internally. A tension in them that wasn't quite visible but that he had learned to see. She stirred what was in the pot without seeming to be focused on the stirring. "My being here," she said finally, "could cost you the ranch." "I don't know that." "You don't know it won't." She didn't say it with accusation. She said it with the same practical precision she brought to supply lists. "If the bank committee uses this as grounds to accelerate the note, you can't cover it. Not right now." "Abigail, I brought this here." Her voice was still steady, but something in it had gone careful in a different way than usual. "My children and I walked through your gate, and I asked you for work, and you gave it, and that was generous. And what's happened to this ranch in the past 3 weeks? That's real, and I'm glad of it. But I'm not going to let my situation destroy what you're trying to save." "You're not destroying anything." "I might be." She set the spoon down and turned to face him. "I need to be honest with you about something. The reason I was walking on that road, the reason I was coming from the direction I was coming from. It's not a simple story, and it's not a pretty one. My husband didn't die of illness. He didn't die in an accident." She paused. "He was a man who believed his family was his to do with as he chose. When I finally left, I walked because I didn't have money for a stage, and I couldn't risk him finding us if I stayed anywhere long enough to work for wages." She looked at him directly. "If someone from my past came looking, if the wrong person found out where I was, that could bring a different kind of trouble to your door than Frank Cutter." The kitchen was very quiet. Garrett looked at the bruise that had been on her jaw when she arrived. Long healed now, fully gone, but he had remembered it all this time without knowing he was remembering it. "Where is he?" Garrett said. "I don't know." She said it flatly. "That's the honest answer. Last I knew he was 3 counties west. But I don't know that for certain, and I haven't known anything for certain about him in a long time, which was the whole point of leaving." "What's his name?" "That doesn't matter right now." "It might matter a great deal." Garrett. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite warning and was not quite pleading. It was something in between, something that said, I have thought about this longer than you have, and I need you to trust that. Right now, what matters is the bank. If the community pressure is real, then my being here is a liability to you in the last 3 weeks. The men haven't said a word about... The men wouldn't. She picked the spoon back up. Davis and Tom and Wheeler, they've been kind to us, and I don't think they have any objection to us being here. But they need this ranch to survive too. If the ranch goes under because of talk about me, they lose their work. Garrett sat down at the table. It was quiet for a moment. Outside, he could hear Caleb and Tom's voices from the direction of the barn, the low back and forth of a conversation about something practical, something that needed doing. He could hear May somewhere, the scrape of a tool against dirt. The garden. She was still working on the garden. Where would you go? He said. She heard the shift in the question, away from argument, toward a different kind of conversation. She heard it, and he could see her register it, a small change in her posture. I haven't worked that out yet, she said. We could move into town if I could find work there. There's a rooming house. On a cook's wages, there won't be room for all 3 of them. I know that. And the rooming house is Nora Hendricks's cousin's place. A pause. I know that too, she said quietly. The impossible geometry of it sat between them. She couldn't stay without costing him the reputation he needed to hold the banknote. She couldn't leave without losing the only stable ground her children had been on in months. The options available to a widowed woman with 3 children and no local family and a past she couldn't fully explain were not, as Garrett was sitting here understanding perhaps for the first time with the full weight of it, options at all. They were variations of the same impossible constraint. They were the arithmetic of a life in which someone else had already spent all the choices. He had grown up the son of Edwin Rowan, and he had grown up with options. And he had used some of them well and some of them poorly, and he had taken most of them for granted the way people take air for granted. He was sitting here now understanding something about the difference between his life and hers that he should have understood earlier and had not, and the understanding was uncomfortable in the specific way that accurate self-knowledge tends to be. Henry came into the kitchen at that moment with a piece of rope in his hand. Davis is teaching me to tie knots, he announced. That's good, Abigail said, and her voice was entirely normal. Whatever she had just been feeling, Henry did not need to see it, and she had made sure he wouldn't. Garrett watched her do this, the seamless shift from one kind of woman to another, and thought about how much practice it took to be that smooth about it, and what that practice had cost her. I can do a square knot, Henry said. He held up the rope and made an attempt at demonstrating this. The result was not clearly a square knot. Almost, he amended. Keep practicing, Garrett told him. Henry looked between the 2 adults with the instinct of a child who has learned to sense when a room is carrying something it isn't saying. He looked at his mother. She smiled at him. A real smile, but a small one. He looked at Garrett. Garrett nodded at him in what he hoped was a reassuring way. Henry went back outside with his rope. He's going to be all right, Garrett said. He wasn't sure what he meant by it exactly. It was the kind of thing a person says when they need to say something true. He usually is, Abigail said. He's the most adaptable of the 3. Caleb holds on to things. May watches and waits. Henry just moves forward. She stirred the pot. He gets that from somewhere other than me. The next morning brought the thing Garrett had been half expecting since Frank Cutter's visit. A letter from Millhaven First Bank and Trust, delivered by the postal rider before breakfast, its language formal and careful and unmistakable. The loan committee had become aware of circumstances regarding the Rowan property that raised concerns about the collateral's stability and the borrower's community standing. They were requesting a meeting at his earliest convenience to discuss the status of the note. It was not a default notice, but it was the step before a default notice. Garrett read it twice at the kitchen table before Abigail was up, then folded it and put it in his pocket and went out to start the morning feed. Davis found him at the water trough. "You all right?" Davis said. "Fine." Davis filled the bucket he was carrying and looked at Garrett sideways with the expression of a man who has worked with people long enough to know the difference between fine and fine. "Tom and I have been talking," Davis said. "About what?" "About what Frank Cutter said when he came out here." He said it simply, no preamble, no apology for having known. Wheeler overheard from the equipment shed. Garrett looked at him. "We don't like it," Davis said. "It's not yours to like or not like." "No," Davis agreed. "It's not. But those children have been on this property for 3 weeks, and that woman has worked harder for this ranch than most men I've known. And if someone runs her off because of talk—" He stopped himself, set the bucket down. "I'm just saying, if it matters, that the three of us have an opinion about it." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "It matters," he said. Davis picked up his bucket. "Thought so," he said, and went back to work. The meeting at the bank was set for Monday. Garrett drove into town on Sunday. Not to the bank, but to the county records office, which kept its own hours, and then to the office of a lawyer named Carl Whitmore, who was the only attorney in Mill Haven, and who owed Edwin Rowan a favor that had never been formally called in. Carl Whitmore was 69 years old, kept pigeons on his roof for reasons he had never explained, and had the reputation of a man who was slow to act and very difficult to stop once he had started. He listened to Garrett for 45 minutes without interrupting. "The bank committee can't call a note based on community sentiment," he said when Garrett was done. "Not legally. Whatever Frank Cutter told them, the loan documents don't have a morality clause." "Can they find another reason?" "They'll look for one if Cutter's pushing them." Carl looked at his hands. "The question is what you want to do about it." "I want to keep my ranch." "That's a financial problem. I can help with that." Carl paused. "The other problem, the one about the woman, that's a different kind of problem. The law doesn't fix reputation." "What fixes reputation?" Carl looked at him over his glasses. "In a town like this, time or marriage. Those are generally the two options, and time is the slower one." Garrett drove back to the ranch in the dark. He sat in the wagon on the road outside his own gate for a few minutes before going in, which was something he had never done before, and which he did now because he needed to be alone with what he was thinking before he was around people again. The sky above the plains was very large and very cold, and entirely indifferent to his situation, and he found this, perversely, somewhat comforting. His father had married his mother fast, too fast, Edwin had once said, not unkindly, but honestly, the way he sometimes got when he'd had a glass of bourbon and Garrett had been old enough to hear it. They had been wrong for each other in certain fundamental ways that neither of them had understood until they were already committed, and the marriage had been a functional one, and not an unhappy one, but it had also not been what either of them had imagined for themselves. Edwin had said once, quietly, with no apparent self-pity, that he hoped Garrett would take more time than he had. Garrett had taken more time. He had taken 35 years, which was, perhaps, more time than his father had meant. The thing about Abigail Mercer was that she was not a person he had been lonely enough to romanticize. He had seen her every day for 3 weeks, tired, worried, sometimes short-tempered with Caleb when the boy pushed into her management of the kitchen, once genuinely frustrated with the stove, in a way she directed at the stove and not at anyone present, but that she was still embarrassed about afterward. He had seen her make a decision and change her mind about it. He had seen her cry once, briefly, standing at the window in the early morning when she thought everyone was still asleep. He had come in quietly for water and seen her and backed out without making a sound and never said anything, because she had not wanted to be seen, and he had understood that. She was not a perfect woman. She was also not a simple one. He sat in the wagon on the road outside his gate, and the cold was serious now, and the wind was picking up from the northwest. And somewhere inside that house, a 4-year-old was asleep in the armchair by the stove, and the kitchen light was on because it was always on, and Abigail Mercer was planning to leave rather than cost him the thing his father had built. He thought about what Carl Whitmore had said. He thought about what Davis had said at the water trough. I thought about the account book and the column with no name for itself. And he thought about Henry's laugh in the kitchen, and May's garden in November, and Caleb's supply list, and the way this property had felt 14 months ago against the way it felt now. He was not a man who moved fast. He had never been. But he understood, sitting on that road in the cold, that what he was considering was not fast. It was actually the slowest and most deliberate thing a person could do, the thing that had the longest reach of any decision in a human life, and that what he was weighing was not only the ranch or the banknote or the gossip of Frank Cutter and Nora Hendricks. He was weighing who he was going to be when this was over. What kind of man? He got down from the wagon and opened his own gate and led the horse inside and put her up for the night. And when he came into the kitchen, Abigail was at the table with Caleb's list again. Always working, always planning forward, unable to stop even when stopping was what she needed. She looked up. She could read him. She had gotten very good at it. "What did the lawyer say?" she asked. He took off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door. He said the bank can't legally call the note on reputation alone. He sat down across from her. But he said they'll look for another reason if Frank Cutter keeps pushing. She nodded. She had known that was coming. "I need to tell you something," Garrett said. "All right." He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked at her. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "I want to be clear about that first. Not because of the ranch, and not because of the cooking, and not because of the supply lists or the fence work or any practical reason. I want you to stay because—" He stopped. Started again. "Because when I come home, the kitchen light is on. And I didn't know how much that mattered until it started, and I don't think I can go back to how it was before. And I know that's not a fair thing to put on you, and I know you have every reason in the world to be careful about what a man tells you he wants. And I'm not asking you for an answer tonight." Abigail was very still. Outside, the wind pushed against the house, and the stove ticked in the silence, and somewhere in the rooms beyond the kitchen, one of the children turned in sleep. "Garrett," she said, and her voice was not what he expected. It was not warm, and it was not cold, and it was not careful. It was just tired. Tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has been managing alone for a very long time. "I have 3 children. I have a past I can't fully account for. I have a man somewhere who has a legal claim to consider me his property. I would be bringing all of that through your door." "You already came through my door," he said. "I opened it." She looked at him. "I know you did," she said. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at the list in front of her, and her hand, which had been resting flat on the paper, curled slightly at the edges, and she said nothing for long enough that Garrett understood the conversation was pausing, not ending. He was a patient man. He had been patient a long time. He could be patient a little longer. He got up and poured himself the last of the coffee and stood by the stove and let the silence be what it was. And the wind continued outside, and the kitchen light stayed on, and Abigail Mercer sat at the oak table with the list in front of her and did not leave. That night, at least, she did not leave. She didn't sleep that night. Garrett knew because he didn't sleep either, and the house had a particular quality of silence when everyone in it was actually asleep, a settled, unanimous quiet, and that quality was absent for most of the night. He could hear, or imagined he could hear, the specific wakefulness of another person in the rooms beyond the kitchen. The particular stillness of someone lying in the dark doing the same thing he was doing, which was thinking through a situation from every angle available and finding that none of the angles made it simple. He got up at 4:30, out of habit, and came into the kitchen, and the stove was already going. She was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and her hands around it, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that was not embarrassed and was not defensive. It was just tired. The same bone tired he had seen in her voice the night before, now visible on her face in the way that a night without sleep makes visible things that the daylight discipline keeps managed. "I made coffee," she said. "I can see that." He poured himself a cup and sat down across from her, not at the head of the table but across from her, which was where he had started sitting sometime in the second week without deciding to. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some." This was probably not true, but it was the answer she was going to give, so he left it. They sat with the coffee between them and the stove going and the dark outside the windows. And neither of them spoke for a few minutes, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have said something true to each other and are now living inside the truth of it before deciding what to do with it. "I've been thinking," she said finally. "So have I." "Let me go first." She set her cup. "What you said last night, I've been turning it over all night, and I want to be honest with you about what I'm afraid of. Because I think you deserve that." She looked at her hands. "I'm afraid that what you're feeling is gratitude dressed up as something else. I came here and the ranch got better, and I know that. And I think sometimes when a person's life improves, they attach the feeling to whoever was present when it happened. And that's not the same as what you said it was." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "You think I've confused gratitude with something else?" he said. "I think it's possible." "And what do you think you'd need to see to know the difference?" She looked up at him. "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest thing she could have said, and they both knew it. "I've been watching you for 3 weeks," he said. Not the way a man watches a woman because she's there and he's lonely. I want to be clear about that. I've been watching you the way you watch a person when you're trying to understand who they actually are, because the way a person does one thing is the way they do everything, and what I've seen is—" He stopped, organized his thoughts, which was not always easy for him. He was a man who thought in images and actions more than words, which had been a source of trouble before. "You gave Henry your food. You rebuilt a garden in November because May needed somewhere to put her energy. You asked Caleb what was wrong with the gate hinge instead of telling him because you wanted him to think it through himself. You left a bowl of dinner on the stove for me without saying anything about it because you knew I'd come in late and wouldn't feed myself." He looked at her across the table. "Those aren't things I noticed because they made me grateful. Those are things I noticed because they tell me who you are." Abigail was very still. "Garrett," she said, "I'm not done." She closed her mouth. "I know you came from something bad. I know the bruise on your jaw when you got here wasn't from a fall. I know there's a man somewhere who you're afraid might come looking. I know you've been managing alone for longer than you should have had to, and I know that's made you careful in ways that are going to take longer than 3 weeks to undo." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I'm not asking you to trust me because I've been decent to you for 3 weeks. 3 weeks isn't enough to earn that, and I know it. I'm asking you to give me the time to earn it properly." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the sky was beginning to change. Not light yet, but the specific quality of darkness that comes just before light, when the black starts to thin at the edges. "What exactly are you asking me?" she said. Her voice was careful, but it was not closed. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "Not to solve the bank problem, not to quiet down Nora Hendricks. Because I want to. Because I've thought about it from every direction I know how to think, and that's what I keep coming back to." The silence after that was different from the silence before it. Abigail picked up her coffee cup and held it and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him with an expression that he couldn't entirely read, which was unusual because he had gotten reasonably good at reading her. And she said, "I have 3 children. I know that. They're not yours." "They're here," he said. "They've been here for 3 weeks. Caleb knows more about my fence situation than I do. May's clearing a garden she's never going to see finished before spring. Henry told Davis this morning that he thinks we need chickens." He paused. "Davis agrees, by the way." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one. "He's been saying that since the first morning," she said. "He's not wrong." She set the cup down again. The almost smile faded back into seriousness, and she looked at him with the direct gray eyes that had been looking at him since the first moment at the gate, the eyes that always seemed to be determining something. "The children would need to agree," she said. "I won't make a decision like this over their heads. Whatever I decide, I talk to them first. That seems right. And I need to know—" She stopped, restarted. "I need to know that what you're offering is permanent, not a rescue, not a solution to a temporary problem. I've been rescued before." The word came out flat and specific, and he understood immediately what kind of rescue she meant and who had offered it and what it had cost her. "I'm not interested in being rescued." "I'm not offering a rescue," he said. "I'm offering a partnership. Same as what we've already been doing, except permanent and legal and with my name on it so Frank Cutter and Nora Hendricks have to find something else to talk about." She looked at him for a long time. "Give me today," she said. "I need to talk to my children. Take whatever time you need." She nodded once, and that was the end of the conversation, and she got up and went to the stove to start breakfast. And Garrett sat with his coffee and looked at the surface of the oak table and thought about his father and what Edwin would have said about this, and couldn't land on an answer. Edwin had been a man of practical decisions. He might have approved of the reasoning. He might have said Garrett was moving too fast. He might have said nothing at all and let the silence do the work, the way he often did. The morning went the way mornings went on the ranch. Hands fed, animals tended, work distributed and undertaken. Garrett told himself he was not watching for any sign of what Abigail was thinking, and then noticed himself checking the kitchen window 3 times before 9 o'clock and stopped pretending. At 10 o'clock, she asked Caleb to come in from wherever he was. Garrett was not in the kitchen for that conversation. He stayed in the barn deliberately, repairing a piece of harness that needed repair, but that he was giving more attention than it strictly required, because he understood that what happened in that kitchen was not his business until she decided it was. She had said she would talk to her children, and that was what she was doing. And the children were not his, and the conversation was not his, and he worked the harness leather and listened to the sounds of the property and waited. Davis appeared in the barn doorway about 40 minutes later. "Boy came and got May from the garden," Davis said. He was not looking at Garrett directly. He was looking at a point somewhere near the harness. "Thought you'd want to know." "I didn't ask you to tell me." "No," Davis agreed. "You didn't." He left. Garrett put the harness down and looked at his hands and thought about Edwin Rowan, who had built this property from 40 acres and a 3-room house into the ranch it currently was, imperfect and struggling as it currently was, and who had done it without asking anyone's permission or waiting for the right moment, because Edwin Rowan had understood that the right moment was not a thing that arrived from outside. It was a thing you decided on and then built from the inside. He had told Garrett that once, about something else entirely. He hadn't understood it at the time. He understood it now. At noon, Abigail came to the barn door. She was wearing her coat, which she put on when she was going somewhere with intention. Her hair was up. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize, which meant it was something new, and new expressions on Abigail Mercer's face were worth paying attention to because she did not produce them carelessly. "The children want to talk to you," she said. He put down what he was holding. "All right," he said. He followed her into the kitchen, and the 3 children were at the table. Caleb in the center with his straight back and his chin up, May on his left with her hands folded in front of her, Henry on his right kicking his legs under the chair because he was 4 and couldn't help it. They looked at Garrett the way a panel of interviewers looks at a candidate, which under other circumstances might have been funny, except that the stakes were clearly real to all 3 of them in different ways. And Garrett understood that his job right now was to treat it as real and not as something to be managed. He sat down across from them. "Your mother said you wanted to talk to me," he said. Caleb looked at May. May looked at Caleb. Some kind of sibling consensus happened in the exchange. Caleb spoke first. "She told us what you asked her." "I figured she did." "She said you asked her to marry you." "That's right." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He was doing the thing where he thought before speaking, which Garrett had come to recognize and respect. "Why?" he said. It was a better question than most adults would have asked, because it was direct and it required a direct answer, and Caleb would know if the answer was evasive. Garrett had learned this about the boy. "Because I think your mother is one of the best people I've ever met," Garrett said, "and because what's happened here in the last 3 weeks, what she built here, what all of you built here, is something I don't want to give up. And because when she said she was going to leave, it felt like the wrong thing, like something going in the wrong direction." Caleb considered this. "That's about us leaving," he said. "That's not about why you want to marry her." Garrett looked at him. "You're right," he said. "Those are 2 different things." He thought about how to say it without it being too much or not enough. "I want to marry her because she's a person I want to spend my life with. The rest of it, the ranch, the problem with the bank, all of that, that's real, and I won't pretend it doesn't factor in. But it's not why." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. His gray eyes, his mother's eyes, did not waver. "Do you love her?" he asked. The question landed in the kitchen with the specific weight of a question asked by someone who genuinely needs the answer and will hear the truth in whatever answer is given. "Yes," Garrett said. No explanation, no qualification, just that. May, who had been silent until now, said quietly, "Would we have to call you father?" "You'd have to call me whatever felt right to you," Garrett said. "I'm not going to tell you what to call me." "What do you want us to call you?" she pressed. May had a particular quality of precision. She wanted the actual information, not the polite version of it. "I'd be glad if someday you wanted to call me something that meant family," he said. "But that's not something I'd ask for. That's something that has to happen on its own or not at all." May looked at her hands. Then she looked up. "Okay," she said, as though she had resolved an internal calculation. Henry, who had been kicking his legs and listening with the concentrated attention of a small person who understands that something important is happening but hasn't fully decoded all the parameters, looked at Garrett and said, "Can we get chickens if you marry Mama?" The kitchen went very quiet for 1 second. Then Abigail, from where she was standing near the stove, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the sound a person makes when a laugh catches them off guard and gets partway out before they can stop it. "Henry," Caleb said. We've needed chickens since the first day, Henry said reasonably. Yes, Garrett said. We can get chickens. Okay. Henry nodded with complete satisfaction, as though the central issue had been resolved and everything else was details. Caleb looked at Garrett for one more moment. Then he looked at his mother, who was still near the stove with that not quite a laugh expression, and something passed between them. Something of the silent variety that older children and their mothers develop after periods of depending on each other. And Caleb nodded once, small and definitive. Okay, he said. Garrett looked at Abigail. She was looking at her children. She was looking at all three of them, and her face had something on it that it didn't usually have, which was the specific unguarded expression of a mother who is looking at the people she has been protecting for a very long time and seeing that they are, at this moment, all right. Not safe. Nothing was safe. She knew that better than anyone. But all right. Here. Present. Not hungry, not cold, not afraid. Her eyes came to Garrett's. Yes, she said. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no fanfare. Henry immediately began talking about what color the chickens should be, and Caleb told him the color of the chickens was irrelevant to their egg production, and May pointed out that neither of them knew enough about chickens to have an opinion, and the kitchen became what it usually was. Inhabited, specific, imperfect, the particular noise of people who lived together deciding things. Garrett sat at the table in the middle of all of it and thought that he had not expected the moment to feel like this. Like something settling rather than something starting. Like a door closing on a draft he hadn't known was in the house until it stopped. He went to the bank meeting on Monday with Carl Whitmore at his side. Gerald Pruitt received them in the meeting room that smelled like old wood and financial anxiety, with two other men from the loan committee whose names Garrett knew and whose presence confirmed that Frank Cutter had indeed been pushing. Carl Whitmore spread his papers on the table with the particular deliberateness of a man who is in no hurry because he knows something the other side doesn't yet know. Gentlemen, Carl said, I believe there may have been some communication suggesting concerns about the personal situation of my client. Before we discuss the loan status, I want to clarify that situation. He produced a document from his folder. Mr. Rowan is engaged to be married. The woman in question has been employed as his household manager for nearly a month. The engagement makes the present domestic arrangement entirely appropriate going forward, and the upcoming marriage resolves any question of impropriety. He set the document down. Now, shall we discuss the loan on its actual financial merits? Gerald Pruitt looked at the document. He looked at Garrett. He looked at Carl. Engaged, he said. As of this weekend, Carl said pleasantly. One of the other committeemen leaned back in his chair with an expression that suggested the wind had been taken from a particular sail he had arrived with. The meeting lasted 45 more minutes and covered the financial specifics in detail. Carl had prepared thoroughly. The cattle sale figures, the reduced operating costs, the property repairs, the spring projections. He had found a state agricultural assistance program that Edwin had never applied for, which Garrett had not known existed, which would provide a modest credit against the note based on property improvement. It was not a large credit. It was enough. When Garrett drove back to the ranch that afternoon, he had an extended repayment schedule, a reduced monthly obligation for the next 6 months, and the agricultural credit applied against the principal. He was not out of trouble, but the shape of the trouble had changed. It had gone from a wall he couldn't see over to a road he could see the end of, far away, and requiring a great deal of walking, but there. He also passed Frank Cutter's property line on the drive back and looked at the fence posts and the well-maintained gate and the house set back from the road that was larger than the Rowan house and older and built on land. Frank Cutter had accumulated by waiting for people to fail and then arriving with offers below value at exactly the moment when failure made refusal feel impossible. He thought about Frank driving up his gate and saying, "I'm trying to help you," and meaning none of it. He thought about what his father would have done with Frank Cutter. He drove past without stopping. The day Garrett told the ranch hands was not a formal occasion. He found them at the bunkhouse at the end of the workday and told them plainly. He was getting married, the wedding would be before the first snow. Everything about the property's daily operation was going to continue as it had been. He said it the way his father would have said it, without ceremony, as information that was relevant to people who needed to know it. Tom Briggs nodded, slow and serious. "About time," he said. "We've been on the property a month," Garrett said. I know how long you've been on the property, Tom said. About time nonetheless. Davis shook Garrett's hand with both of his, which was not a thing Davis normally did, and said nothing because he was one of those men who used handshakes the way other people use speeches. Wheeler, who was 19 and had perhaps been more affected by the last month than he had shown, looked at the floor for a moment and then looked up and said, I'm glad. I mean it. I'm really glad. With the directness of youth that hasn't yet learned to keep gladness to itself. Garrett was not a man who cried. He had not cried at his father's funeral, which some people had interpreted as hardness, and which had actually been something closer to shock that had taken weeks to resolve itself properly. He did not cry now, but he felt something in his chest that was not small and that needed a moment to be sat with, and he looked at these three men, the ones who had stayed, the ones who had eaten cold beans out of a shared can and fixed fences in November, cold and stayed anyway. And he thought that his father had been right about one thing above all others, which was that the quality of a ranch was not in its land or its cattle or its equipment, it was in its people. The problem arrived on a Wednesday. Not a metaphorical problem, a literal one, in the form of a man on a horse who came up the drive at midday while Garrett was with the cattle in the east pasture, while Abigail was in the kitchen, while the children were at their various occupations around the property. His name, Abigail would tell Garrett later, was Wade Mercer. He was 38 years old. He was her husband, legally, formally, in the eyes of county records 3 states west, from whom she had never been divorced because divorce required money, and lawyers and a stability she had not had since she left. He had been looking for her for 6 weeks. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard and looked out the window and saw him and felt a thing in her body that was not fear exactly. Fear had been her constant companion long enough that it no longer arrived as a surprise, but was rather the specific dread of a threat that you have been expecting while hoping you were wrong to expect it. She did not run. She had run before, and it had only delayed this. She wiped her hands on her apron, and she went to the kitchen door, and she opened it and stood in the doorway. Wade Mercer pulled up his horse and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who considers himself patient in the way that predators are patient, not because they don't want the thing, but because they know they're going to get it. Abby, he said. Wade. Her voice was flat and steady. She had made it that way. She needed it to stay that way. You ran a long way, he said. Far enough that you had to look. He smiled. It was a specific kind of smile that she knew in her body rather than her mind, the smile that preceded a particular kind of conversation. You know you can't just leave, he said. You know that. We've been through this. I have a job here, she said. I work for the owner of this property. You're trespassing. You're my wife. I'm employed, she said. Leave. He was getting off his horse when the sound came from the other side of the yard. Garrett's boots on the hard ground, coming fast. Having seen from the east pasture the unfamiliar horse in the yard, and come back at a pace that said he understood before he arrived that this was not a casual visitor. He came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw the configuration. Abigail in the doorway, the stranger half off his horse, and the specific tension in the yard that told him everything he needed to know about the relationship. Wade Mercer looked at Garrett, looked him up and down with the evaluating look of a man accustomed to measuring threats. This your ranch? Wade said. It is, Garrett said. He walked across the yard at a deliberate pace and stood between Abigail's doorway and Wade Mercer. Not aggressive, just present, taking up the space that needed taking up. And you're on it without an invitation. I'm here for my wife. Your wife works for me, Garrett said. She's also my fiancée. So I'd be interested to hear how you figure on both of those things being true simultaneously. Wade's expression shifted. Something tightened in it. He finished getting off the horse because he had been in the process of doing so, and stopping now would have felt like retreat. And then he was standing on the ground, and Garrett was between him and the door, and they were approximately the same height, which was the kind of thing men calculate in moments like this without deciding to. You don't know what you're involved in, Wade said. I know she left, Garrett said. And I know she walked a long way to make sure you couldn't find her easily. And I know what a bruise that old means about how she got it. That tells me most of what I need to know about what I'm involved in. Wade looked past Garrett at Abigail. Abby. Don't, she said. "You can't just—" "She can," Garrett said. "She did, and she's staying." His voice was entirely level. Not raised, not threatening, just factual, in the way that his father's quiet had been factual. The kind of voice that makes the statement it's making without needing to make it twice. If you have a legal argument to make about your marriage, you make it to a lawyer. You don't make it on my property. I'm going to ask you once to get back on your horse. The yard was quiet. From somewhere around the back of the house came the sound of Henry's voice, talking to the chickens they hadn't gotten yet in a conversation he seemed to be having about it with Davis. Normal. Ordinary. The sound of a child in a place he felt safe. Wade Mercer heard it. Something moved in his face at the sound of the child's voice, something complicated and not entirely simple to read, which was the worst kind of expression on that kind of man. "Those are my children," he said. "They are," Garrett said, "and they live here. That's not changing." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Wade put his foot back in the stirrup and pulled himself up and sat on the horse and looked down at Garrett with the expression of a man who is retreating but filing the act away as temporary. "This isn't finished," he said. "I expect not," Garrett said, "but it's finished for today. And next time, you come to Carl Whitmore's office on Main Street in Mill Haven and you bring your own lawyer because that's the only conversation left to have." Wade Mercer looked at Abigail one more time over Garrett's shoulder. She met his eyes without flinching. It cost her something. Garrett could see what it cost her, but she held it. He rode down the drive without another word. Garrett stood in the yard until the sound of the horse was gone. Then he turned around. Abigail was still in the doorway. She had one hand on the door frame, and she was gripping it harder than she needed to, and she was breathing in the careful way of someone managing something physical, a response in the body that the mind is working to regulate. "Are you all right?" he said. She took a breath. Let it out. "I told you he might come," she said. "You did." "I should have told you sooner." "You told me when you could," he said. "That's how it goes." She looked at him across the yard. This man who had gotten between her and the things she had been afraid of, not with violence, not with drama, but with the simple occupying of space and the flat, factual voice that said, "Not here, not today, not while I'm standing." And her face did something it very rarely did, which was lose its management entirely for one unguarded moment. She pressed her lips together and looked away. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came inside. He sat at the oak table while she put the kettle on, and the kitchen sounds resumed around them. The stove, the kettle, the ordinary noises of the place. And from outside, Henry's voice continued its cheerful monologue to the non-existent chickens, and Davis's occasional response floated over from the direction of the fence. "Carl Whitmore can handle the legal side," Garrett said. "The marriage certificate and the county records on his claim. Carl's dealt with worse than Wade Mercer. He won't let it go easily." "No," Garrett said. "He won't." But easy was never really on the table. He looked at his hands on the oak surface of his father's table. "I knew that before today." She poured the coffee and brought it and sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around the cup the way she had that morning before dawn when none of this had been decided yet. And she looked at him with those direct gray eyes and said, quietly and precisely, "Why aren't you scared?" He looked back at her. "I am scared," he said. "I'm scared of losing the ranch, and I'm scared of what Mercer might do, and I'm scared of getting this wrong, because getting it wrong matters more than most things I've gotten wrong before." He picked up his cup. "But scared isn't the same as stopped." Abigail Mercer looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "It isn't." Outside, Henry had apparently found Davis's actual attention because the one-sided conversation had become two-sided, and the sound of the two of them, the 4-year-old and the weathered ranch hand, carrying on a dialogue about something with complete mutual seriousness, drifted through the kitchen window. And in the warmth of the kitchen, in the ordinary noise of the house going on around them, Abigail Mercer let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. She didn't say anything else, neither did he. The coffee cooled in their cups and neither of them moved to get up, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window, and the stove ticked steadily, and the ranch went on being what it had become, imperfect, provisional, held together with wire and work, and the daily decision to keep going. And that was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. Carl Whitmore filed the paperwork on a Thursday morning, same day of the week that the cattle sale had gone through, which Garrett noted without attaching any particular meaning to it, because he was not a superstitious man. The filing was a response to Wade Mercer's legal claim of abandonment against Abigail, which Wade had apparently submitted through a lawyer in Haskell County, 3 states west. A lawyer whose letterhead, Carl observed dryly, suggested a man who did most of his business helping husbands locate wives who had made the reasonable decision to leave them. He planned this, Carl said. He was sitting behind his desk with the Haskell County filing in front of him and his reading glasses on the end of his nose. He didn't just come looking for her. He had the legal groundwork in place before he wrote up your drive. That's a man who's done this before or had help from someone who has. Garrett sat across the desk. What does it mean for Abigail? It means he's trying to establish that she abandoned the marriage and took his children without consent. In some jurisdictions that has teeth. In this jurisdiction, Carl set the papers down. In this jurisdiction, it means he filed in the wrong county and his lawyer knows it and filed here anyway, hoping she wouldn't have representation. He took his glasses off. She has representation. What do we need? A few things. Her testimony about why she left, documented. Any evidence of the circumstances that made leaving necessary. Carl paused in the way he paused when he was about to say something he wanted received carefully. The bruise you described when she arrived, did anyone else see it? Davis Polk, Tom Briggs, Wheeler, all 3 of them saw her the first night. I'll need statements from all 3. Garrett looked at him. They'll give them. Carl nodded. And I'll need her to sit down with me and tell me everything, not the managed version, everything. He looked at Garrett over the desk. She's going to find that difficult. I know. Make sure she knows I'm on her side before she comes in. People who've been in her situation have a hard time believing that officers of any kind, legal, official, any kind, are actually working for them rather than against them. It's not irrational. It's learned. Garrett sat with that for a moment. I'll tell her, he said. The conversation with Abigail that evening was not easy. Not because she refused. She didn't refuse. She was past the point of refusing help when help was available, and she understood it as genuine. But because telling it required her to reassemble a sequence of events she had spent 6 months trying to put distance between herself and distance, it turns out, is not the same as healing. She sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and she told Garrett first before Carl because she needed to tell someone she trusted before she told someone she didn't yet fully trust, even if he was on her side. She told him about the first year, which had been ordinary and not terrible. She told him about the second year when Wade's drinking changed character. Not worse necessarily, but different, more purposeful, aimed. She told him about the first time, which she had believed was an aberration, because you always believe the first time is an aberration. She told him about the years between the first time and the last, which were not a continuous catastrophe, but were rather a landscape of unpredictability. Good weeks, sometimes good months, long enough to make her doubt her own accounting of the bad ones. She told him about Caleb watching from doorways. She told him about May learning to read the sound of boots on the porch. She told him about Henry, who had been born into it, and therefore had no before to compare it to and just accepted it as what life was, which was in some ways the worst part of all of it. She told him about the morning she left, what had happened the night before, what she had taken and what she had left behind, and how she had carried Henry and walked through the dark to the road and kept walking because stopping felt more dangerous than the dark and the cold and the unknown direction. Garrett sat at the table and listened without interrupting. When she was done, the kitchen was very quiet. She was not crying. She had cried about this, she said, but not recently, and she did not seem to want to cry now. She seemed to want to be believed, which was a different thing and in some ways a harder thing to offer because belief required taking in what you'd been told and letting it be true without qualification. I believe you, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said, and her voice had something in it that wasn't quite relief. It was older than relief, more complicated. It was the sound of a person who has said a true thing to many people over many years and been responded to in many different ways and has learned not to expect the response they needed, and who was now receiving it anyway and didn't know immediately what to do with it. Carl Whitmore is good, Garrett said, and he's discreet. What you tell him stays in his office. She nodded, and Davis and Tom and Wheeler will give statements. She looked at him sharply. You already asked them? Carl asked me if they'd seen the bruise. I said yes. I said they'd give statements. He met her eyes. They were there. They saw what they saw. For a moment she looked like she might argue, the reflex of a woman who had spent years trying to contain her situation, to keep it from spreading outward and touching other people, partly from shame and partly from the practical understanding that the more people knew, the more uncontrollable it became. He could see her working through it. All right, she said. The statements were given. Carl filed his response. The legal process began its slow institutional grinding, which was not dramatic and was not fast, and was not the kind of thing that resolved itself in a single moment, but rather accumulated over weeks, filings and responses, and a scheduled hearing date that Carl said was standard procedure and not cause for alarm. In the meantime, the ranch continued. There was a particular comfort in that, in the fact that whatever the legal situation was doing in Carl Whitmore's office, the cattle still needed feeding, and the fence still needed maintaining, and the water pump still needed monitoring, and there was work every day that was specific and physical and demanded attention in a way that left less room for the abstract dread of waiting. Garrett had always known this about ranch work, but had never been so grateful for it as he was that November, when the days were short and the cold was serious, and the list of things that needed doing was, as always, longer than the hours available to do them. Caleb had by this point become genuinely useful in the way that a 10-year-old with his particular qualities could be useful, not in the heavy physical work, but in the organizational intelligence of the operation. He had expanded his supply list methodology to cover the bunkhouse inventory as well as the kitchen, and Davis had started consulting him before driving into town, which Davis treated as a purely practical arrangement, and Caleb treated with the careful nonchalance of a person trying not to show how much it meant to be taken seriously. Tom Briggs's back had improved enough that he was moving nearly normally, and he had taken on the water pump monitoring with a rigor that suggested personal investment. The pump had become Tom's project in the same way that the garden had become May's project, a piece of the property that someone had claimed not because they were assigned it, but because the property had asked for it and the person had answered. May's garden, through November's cold, was a rectangle of turned dark earth and carefully cleared beds, waiting. She had gotten the soil amended with compost from the pile behind the barn that Dottie had maintained and that May had found and begun turning again. She had drawn a planting chart on paper. What would go where, when it would go in, what would come in earliest, and what would need longer. She had shown it to Garrett once, not for approval, but for information, as though updating a partner on a project status. He had looked at the chart and thought that May Mercer was going to be a formidable person, and that whoever eventually encountered her in the world should probably be prepared for that. Henry got his chickens 2 weeks before the wedding. This happened because Garrett drove past a farm on the road to town and saw a hand-lettered sign that said "Laying Hens for Sale," and pulled over without deliberating about it, which was not typical of him but which felt correct in the particular uncomplicated way that some decisions feel. He came home with 6 Rhode Island Reds in a crate, wagon bed, and Henry, who was in the yard when he pulled in, stopped what he was doing and looked at the crate, and then looked at Garrett, and then looked at the crate again. "Are those chickens?" Henry said. "They are." Henry approached the crate with the reverence of a small person whose most persistent wish has been unexpectedly granted. He crouched down in front of it and looked through the slats at the hens, who regarded him with the blank equanimity of chickens, who have opinions about very few things. "Hi," Henry said to the chickens. The chickens did not respond, but Henry did not seem to require response. "We have to build them a house," he said, without looking away from the crate. "We do," Garrett said. "I can help." "I know you can." Henry looked up at him then, with the direct, uncalculating look of a 4-year-old whose relationship with the world is still mostly straightforward. "Thank you," he said. Not performed, not coached, just the plain words of a child who means them. Garrett crouched down to the boy's level and looked at him. "You're welcome, Henry," he said. The chicken coop was built that weekend by Garrett and Caleb and Wheeler and Henry, who contributed primarily moral support and occasional commentary on the proceedings. It was not a beautiful structure. It was functional and solid and had a door that latched properly and a roof that would keep rain out, and when it was done, Henry inspected it with his hands behind his back in the posture of a foreman evaluating work, and declared it good. "Good. It needs a name," Henry said. "Chicken coops don't have names," Caleb said. "This one does. Henry said with finality, and named it the Palace, which everyone agreed was optimistic but nobody disputed. The wedding was set for the Saturday before the first projected snow, which the sky had been suggesting was coming soon. Carl Whitmore had filed what he needed to file, and the hearing on Wade Mercer's claim was scheduled for January, 2 months away, and Carl's assessment was cautiously positive. The evidence was clear, the jurisdiction was correct, and Wade Mercer's lawyer had already made 2 procedural errors that suggested he was not accustomed to having the other side show up with competent representation. January, Abigail said when Carl told her. It might extend past January, Carl said. These things take time. But we'll win. Carl looked at her over his glasses. Mrs. Mercer, in my experience, the word win is complicated in family court. What I can tell you is that the evidence strongly supports your position and that Wade Mercer is going to have a very difficult time convincing any judge in this county that a woman with documented cause for leaving and 3 healthy, settled children should be compelled to return to a situation that... He stopped himself. You will be fine, he said. I believe that. Abigail nodded. She was quiet on the drive back to the ranch. Garrett did not fill the silence. He had learned that her silences were not empty. They were working silences, processing silences, the kind that required space rather than conversation. He drove and she sat beside him in the wagon with her hands in her lap, and the cold air around them, and the bare November trees along the road. And at some point her right hand moved from her lap and rested on the wagon seat near his left hand, not touching, but near. He moved his hand so they were touching. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. They drove the rest of the way like that. The Saturday arrived cold and bright in the way of late November days that feel like the weather has dressed up for the occasion without being told to. The sky was the particular blue that only happens when it's cold enough to sharpen everything, and the light on the plains was flat and clean and silver-edged, and the Rowan Ranch looked in that light less like a struggling operation and more like what it had originally been designed to be. A working property that fit its landscape, built to last by someone who understood that the land and the people on it were in a relationship that required mutual commitment. There was no preacher. Garrett had asked Carl Whitmore, who had the county authority to perform civil ceremonies, and Carl had said yes with the particular expression of a man who found this personally satisfying. The ceremony was in the kitchen. This was not the original plan. The original plan had been outside, in the yard, but the morning had brought a wind that made outside impractical, and Abigail had said, without particular sentiment, that the kitchen made more sense anyway, which was true because the kitchen was where the ranch actually lived. Carl stood at one end of the oak table and Garrett and Abigail stood across from each other, and the 4 ranch hands stood along the wall, Davis and Tom and Wheeler, and a 4th hand named Pete Aldridge, who had been hired in November when the workload had grown enough to need him, a quiet man of 42 who had fit into the ranch's rhythm without disruption. The children stood together. Caleb was straight-backed and serious in the way he was serious about things that mattered to him. May had found somewhere a piece of ribbon and put it in her hair, which she would not have admitted was for the occasion, but which everyone understood was for the occasion. Henry was holding a hen. Henry, Abigail said. She wanted to come, Henry said. Put her back. She'll be lonely. Henry. Wheeler opened the kitchen door and Henry took the hen outside with the apologetic posture of a small person managing a misunderstanding and returned 30 seconds later without the hen and stood beside his siblings and folded his hands in imitation of Caleb's posture. Carl Whitmore performed the ceremony in the spare, plain language of a civil proceeding, which suited both of them. There was no poetry. There was no elaborate vow. There was the basic legal formula, and then Carl looked at Garrett and said, Do you take this woman as your lawful wife, to remain with her in all conditions, to treat her and her children as your own family, for as long as you both live? Garrett looked at Abigail. I do, he said. Carl looked at Abigail. And do you take this man as your lawful husband, to remain with him in all conditions, accepting his commitment to you and your children for as long as you both live? Abigail was looking at Garrett. Her gray eyes were steady. Her face was not performing anything, not joy, not relief, not the beautiful simplicity that occasions like this sometimes demand of people. It was just her face, looking at him, the same face that had been looking at him since the gate, the face that always seemed to be determining something. What it was determining now, he thought, was whether this was real. "I do," she said. Carl said the final words, and that was that, legally and factually, and Davis started something that was supposed to be contained applause but became something more, and Wheeler let out a sound that was not quite a whoop, but was in the family of whoops, and Tom Briggs shook Carl Whitmore's hand with both of his, which was the same thing he'd done to Garrett, and which was apparently Tom's highest available expression of approval, and Henry immediately ran back outside, presumably to retrieve the hen and inform her that something important had happened. Abigail looked at Garrett, and he looked at her, and she said, quietly enough that only he heard it, "Don't make me regret this." He almost laughed. He caught it and said, "I'll do my best." "Your best better be good." "It's been pretty good so far." She pressed her lips together against something that was almost a smile. "We'll see," she said, which was exactly the right answer, and they both knew it. The meal afterward was naturally remarkable. Abigail had been cooking since before dawn. The bread and the pies and a roast that had been slow in the oven since the previous evening, and that filled the kitchen with a smell that had made everyone on the property drift toward the house throughout the morning with increasing frequency. She had made Caleb's favorite, which was a thing she called a bean cake, and which was actually cornbread with beans cooked into it. In a specific way she had learned from her own mother years ago in a place she didn't often talk about. She had made sweet potato with molasses for Henry, who had opinions about sweet potato. She had made a plain sponge cake with apple preserves for May, who had asked for it specifically and who sat at the table eating it with the expression of someone receiving exactly what they requested and finding the experience satisfying. They ate around the oak table, all of them, the Hands and Carl Whitmore and the family, too many people for the table but managing anyway in the way that kitchens manage when they're asked to hold more than their technical capacity, which is usually more than you think. Davis made a toast that was 3 sentences long and did not waste a word. Wheeler made a toast that was considerably longer and wandered a bit, but landed genuinely at the end. Tom raised his glass and said nothing, which from Tom was the most eloquent thing available. Carl Whitmore ate 2 helpings of everything and said, as he was leaving, Edwin would have approved. He said it to Garrett quietly at the door. Not of everything the way things happened, but of this, of the result. He put his hat on. He was a hard man, but he knew what things were for. Garrett shook his hand. "Thank you, Carl," he said. "Don't thank me. Win the January hearing." Carl stepped off the porch. "And fix that gate hinge. It's been loose since August." The snow came 4 days after the wedding, not the light dusting that sometimes came first. The real snow, serious and decided, 3 inches overnight and more through the following day. The kind of snow that reorganizes a ranch's priorities and tests every preparation made in the weeks before it. Garrett was up before 4, checking the animals and the outbuildings and the water pump, which Tom had insulated in October with a thoroughness that was now demonstrating its value. The cattle were in the covered section of the east pasture. The equipment shed roof was holding. They'd gotten the tin on it in November. Davis had found the contact and the price had been manageable, and the work had been done on a Saturday with everyone on the property contributing. The chicken coop, the palace, was standing in 4 inches of snow with its door latched and its 6 inhabitants audible from 6 feet away in the morning quiet, apparently indignant about the weather. Garrett came back inside at 5:30 to the stove already going. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. This was still the moment that got him. Every morning, the stove going, the kitchen warm, the smell of coffee. He had grown up in this kitchen with his father, who was not a man of warmth, and the kitchen had been functional, a place where food happened. And then Dottie had made it a place where people happened, and then Dottie had left and it had gone back to being functional and empty. And now it was this again, this warm, inhabited thing. And he understood that he had almost let it stay empty because asking for help was something Edwin Rowan's son had not been taught to do. Abigail turned from the stove and looked at him. "The pump?" she said. "Holding." "The roof?" "Good." She turned back. "Coffee's ready." He came in and poured his cup and sat at the table, and she sat across from him with hers, and the snow fell outside the window in the particular quiet of heavy snowfall, which absorbs sound and makes the world smaller and more immediate. "First snow," she said. "First one. Caleb wants to help with the cattle today." "He can if Tom thinks he's ready." Tom already said yes. Caleb asked him yesterday. She wrapped her hands around her cup. "He asked Tom, not me. Garrett looked at her. Is that all right? She thought about it. Actually thought about it, which was something he'd come to appreciate. She didn't give automatic answers, she gave the ones she'd considered. Yes, she said. It's all right. It's what I wanted for him. Someone to learn from who isn't me. She looked out the window at the snow. He needed that. I couldn't give him everything. Nobody can, Garrett said. I know, She stopped. I spent a long time trying to be everything because there was nothing else. It's an old habit. Old habits take time. She drank her coffee. May asked me last night if she could start seeds indoors, in the window boxes, for the garden. Said she didn't want to wait until March. What did you tell her? I said ask Garrett, it's his window boxes. He looked at her. She didn't ask me. She will. The almost smile. She's working up to it. She wanted to know if I thought you'd say yes first. What did you tell her? I told her to ask you. She set her cup down. You're her. She looks at you differently than she looks at most people. I wanted her to learn that asking is safe here, that the answer doesn't have to be guessed at before you ask. Garrett sat with that. He thought about May in the kitchen doorway that first morning, watching him with her careful, assessing eyes. He thought about her folding her hands at the wedding with the ribbon in her hair. She wouldn't admit was deliberate. He thought about her planting chart on the paper, the one that mapped the whole season of growing before the ground was even ready. She can have the window boxes, he said. All of them. The January hearing arrived and proved Carl Whitmore right about most things, and more complicated than he'd predicted about a few. Wade Mercer appeared with his Haskell County lawyer and presented his case, which was thinner than it had sounded in correspondence because the documentation he had relied on proved to have procedural problems that Carl had identified, and that the judge, a woman named Honorable Doris Falk, 61 years old, who had been presiding over family cases in this county for 22 years, and who had heard most of the available variations on this particular story, reviewed with the expression of someone who has been presented with a familiar argument and found it no more persuasive than the previous times. The statements from Davis and Tom and Wheeler were entered. Abigail testified. She sat in the chair beside Carl's table, and she answered the questions in her flat, steady voice, and she did not embellish, and she did not minimize, and she did not perform. She told the truth in the organized, factual way she approached everything, and Judge Falk listened with the attention of someone who understands that behind every case file is a person, and that the person is what the proceeding is actually about. Wade Mercer's lawyer made his argument. Wade himself sat in the opposite table and looked for the first time like what he actually was. A man whose claim depended on a version of events that required the listener to discount everything the other side had said and to take on faith that a woman who had walked for days across Winter Prairie with 3 children was doing something unreasonable rather than something necessary. Judge Falk ruled on the custody matter that same day, which Carl had not predicted and which suggested she had made up her mind before the end of the testimony. The children would remain with their mother. Wade Mercer was granted no custodial rights pending a further review in 6 months, at which point his compliance with a set of court-ordered conditions would determine whether any supervised access was appropriate. The divorce filing was set for February. Carl said it would be uncontested once Wade's lawyer saw the terms, and Carl was right. Wade Mercer's lawyer filed for the uncontested proceeding in the 3rd week of February, and by March the marriage to Wade Mercer was legally concluded. Abigail stood outside Carl's office on the main street of Millhaven in the pale March sun and held the dissolution papers in her hand and looked at them for a moment, and then folded them and put them in her coat pocket. Okay, she said. Not to Garrett specifically, to the fact of it, to the air. Okay, he said. She looked at him. The sun was in her eyes and she squinted against it, and in that squinting she looked for just a moment, like someone who has set down something heavy they have been carrying for a very long time and is noticing, with some surprise, what their arms feel like without the weight. I want pie, she said. Nellie's has pie, he said. I know Nellie's has pie. Let's get pie. They went to Nellie's and got pie and sat in a booth, and Abigail ate an entire piece of apple pie without offering any of it to anyone, which she almost never did. And Garrett ate his cherry and watched her and thought about Roy Hatch, saying your daddy always fed his people, and about how incomplete that sentence was in retrospect, how feeding people was only the beginning of what Edwin had understood, and how Garrett had been so focused on the crisis of the ranch that he had almost missed the thing the ranch was actually teaching him, which was that a place is only what it is because of who is in it and what they choose to do for each other. Spring came the way spring comes on the Texas plains, not gently, not all at once, but in negotiation, cold mornings and warm afternoons that kept shifting the balance, until one day the balance simply tipped and stayed tipped, and the ground softened and the light changed, and May was in the garden before anyone told her it was time. The seeds she had started in the window boxes, the ones she had brought to Garrett with a planting proposal that was detailed enough to be a business case, which he had approved in full, all of them, every box. Those seedlings were transplanted to the garden in April, carefully, with Caleb helping because he had read something about root systems in a book Tom had, and Henry helping because he was Henry and you couldn't keep him out. The first things came up in May, radishes and lettuce and the early beans green and definitive in the turned earth. May stood at the garden edge and looked at them with her arms crossed in an expression that was not triumph. Triumph was too large and too performative for May, but was a kind of deep private satisfaction that didn't need an audience. Garrett stood beside her. "You did that," he said. "We did," she said. "You fixed the soil pump so the irrigation line worked. You grew the things. Caleb amended the soil." "May." She looked at him sidelong. "You did that," he said again. She looked back at the garden. "I know," she said quietly. The ranch hand situation had stabilized at 5. Davis, Tom, Wheeler, Pete Aldridge, and a woman named Frances Oakes, who had come on in February to help with the spring workload and who turned out to be the most efficient cattle handler any of them had ever seen, which produced a week of awkward readjustment in the bunkhouse, followed by a unanimous conclusion that competence was competence. The spring herd was bigger than the fall. Not dramatically bigger, but enough. Enough to meet the next bank payment with something left over. Not comfort exactly, but margin, which was the next thing up from bare survival and which Garrett treated with appropriate respect. He paid Gerald Pruitt in person, on the due date, in full. Pruitt received the payment with the expression of a banker who has been proven wrong about something and is too professionally careful to show how much that bothers him. Garrett thanked him and shook his hand and left without editorializing. Frank Cutter had made no further appearances at the Rowan gate. Nora Hendricks had, in March, sent a card congratulating them on the wedding. The card was 3 months late and was clearly motivated by whatever social calculation had determined that the congratulations were now more advantageous than the gossip. Abigail had read the card and set it on the counter and said nothing about it, and 2 days later it was gone, and neither of them mentioned it. The morning of the summer solstice, Garrett woke early because a sound had pulled him from sleep that took a moment to identify. He lay in the dark, listening. Then he got up and went to the window. In the yard below, Caleb and Tom Briggs were already at work. The sun was barely up. The light was the pale gold of very early morning. And the two of them were at the fence along the south pasture, working a section that had been on the list for a month. Tom was showing Caleb something about the post placement, moving his hands to demonstrate an angle, and Caleb was watching with the focused intensity he brought to anything Tom showed him. They were talking, their voices too low to hear through the window, and whatever Tom was saying made Caleb nod and then try it himself, and Tom adjusted his grip position without comment, and they went on working. Garrett stood at the window and watched them for a while. He thought about Edwin Rowan, who had stood in this same house and looked out at this same land for 40 years, and had understood it as his responsibility, his obligation, his legacy. He had not been a warm man. He had not been easy to love exactly, though he had been possible to love, and Garrett had managed it with the complicated depth that sons manage love for difficult fathers. Edwin had built something here, and he had wanted Garrett to continue it, and the wanting had come out as pressure and expectation rather than guidance, which was the way Edwin expressed most of what he felt. And Garrett had spent a long time being not quite enough for that expectation and knowing it. He did not think he was Edwin. He thought he was something else, something the ranch needed that Edwin hadn't been, and that Edwin perhaps hadn't needed to be because the times he lived in hadn't required it. The ranch now needed what Abigail had brought in through the gate that October morning: the kitchen light, the warmth, the understanding that a place is only as strong as the people who feel at home in it, and that people feel at home where they are seen and fed and trusted and given work that matters. That was what had saved the ranch. Not Garrett's management, not the cattle sale, not Carl Whitmore's paperwork. The ranch had been saved by the understanding, finally arrived at by Garrett Rowan 35 years into his life, that you cannot hold a place together by yourself. You hold it together with the people who are willing to hold it with you, and those people will only hold it if you make it worth holding. He heard Abigail in the kitchen below, the stove, the coffee, the beginning of the day. He got dressed and went downstairs. She was at the stove and she heard him come in, and she said, without turning around, "Davis wants to discuss the east pasture drainage before the afternoon. I know, he told me yesterday. The pipe under the creek crossing is going to go before winter. I know that too. It's going to be expensive. Carl found another agricultural credit we might qualify for." She turned and looked at him. "When did he tell you that?" "Last week. I was going to bring it up tonight." She looked at him with the expression she got when information had been withheld from her even briefly, which was not anger, but was its close neighbor. "Don't hold things back," she said. "I wasn't holding it back. Garrett, I was waiting for a good moment. There's no good moment for practical information. There's just information." She pointed at the table. "Sit down. Tell me what Carl said." He sat down and told her what Carl said, and she listened and asked 3 questions that were better than the ones he would have thought to ask. And by the end of breakfast, they had the beginning of a plan for the drainage pipe that was different from what he'd been thinking and was probably better. This was how it went, was how it kept going. Not smoothly, not without friction, not without the specific abrasions of 2 people with different habits and histories sharing the daily management of a life. They disagreed about money more often than anything else, because Abigail's instinct was always to spend less, and Garrett's was to invest, and the truth was usually somewhere between them, and finding the somewhere took the kind of conversation that was not always comfortable. They disagreed about the children sometimes too, about how much latitude Caleb needed and how much structure, about whether May's self-sufficiency was strength or protection that needed to be gently undermined, about Henry, who presented no particular disagreement because Henry was Henry, and the only question with Henry was how to channel the energy. The energy, it turned out, was best channeled toward the chickens, which Henry had now named individually and managed with a proprietary seriousness that the hens had accepted, as hens accept most things, with philosophical indifference. What Garrett understood, by the time summer was full, was that love between adults is not a feeling that arrives and stays. It is a practice. It is the choice, made daily and sometimes hourly, to keep showing up for the person you've committed to showing up for, even when showing up is inconvenient or uncomfortable or requires admitting you were wrong. He had not known this before in any way that mattered. He had known it abstractly, the way people know things they've heard without having lived through them. He knew it differently now, in his body, in the specific texture of waking up every morning and making the choice again. Abigail knew it differently than he did. She had been making that choice in the wrong direction for years, making it towards someone who spent it badly. And what she was doing now was learning to make it towards someone who tried not to spend it badly, which was not the same as easy, but was better. He saw her learning this. He saw it in the way she slowly, over months, stopped startling when he came into a room suddenly. He saw it in the way she started offering opinions without first checking whether he wanted them. He saw it in the small concessions she made to being taken care of. The times she let someone else carry something. The times she ate her full portion without redistributing. The times she slept past 5 o'clock because she had decided, experimentally, that it was allowed. On a Thursday evening in August, almost exactly a year from the day Edwin Rowan had died, Garrett sat on the porch of his father's house and watched the sun go down over the ranch. And the ranch was different from what it had been 14 months ago in every way that mattered, and in some ways that were hard to quantify, and some that were easy. The easy ones, 5 hands working, the east fence solid, the water pump reliable, the equipment shed sound, the banknote on schedule, the spring garden having produced enough to reduce the grocery account by 30%, the fall herd already looking better than the year before, the hard to quantify ones, the feeling of the property, the way it occupied its land, the way the people on it moved, with purpose, with some lightness, with the particular ease of people who feel that where they are is where they're supposed to be. He heard the screen door behind him. Abigail came out and sat beside him in the other porch chair, the one that had always been there and that nobody had sat in his memory, as often as she sat in it now. She had a cup of coffee. She held it in both hands the way she always did. Henry named the new one Biscuit, she said. The hen? The hen. That's a good name. He's named 3 of them food names now. Davis is worried about his relationship with meat. Garrett almost laughed. They sat in the cooling evening, and the land was quiet in the way of late summer evenings when the heat is releasing and the sky goes those colors it only goes at that specific hour. And the cattle were settled in the east pasture and the chickens were in the palace. And somewhere inside the house, Caleb was doing something with a book, and May was doing something with seeds she was saving, and Henry was probably talking to Biscuit. "I've been thinking," Abigail said. "About what?" "About what this place is." She looked out at the land. "Your father built it to be a ranch, and it is that. But it's also," she thought about the word, "it's a place where people come back to." Davis came back to work after his brother's death because he said this was the only place that felt like he had something to do. Frances Oakes told me last week that she turned down a higher wage in Abilene because she didn't want to leave. She paused. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "I'm not saying change anything. I'm just saying," she looked at him, "your father fed his people." That was the thing Roy said, wasn't it? At the start. That's what Roy said. "We feed people here," she said. "That's what this place is underneath all the rest of it. The cattle and the fences and the banknotes, those are what keeps it standing. But what it actually is a place where people get fed." Garrett looked at his wife in the last of the August light. He thought about Roy Hatch on his horse at the end of the drive, looking back with pity in his face. He thought about Abigail in the road with the sleeping child on her hip and the bag over her shoulder and the mathematics of impossibility on her face. He thought about Henry at the kitchen table saying, "Do you have food with the directness of a child who does not yet know to be ashamed of needing?" He thought about what it had taken to open a gate. Not courage exactly. Exhaustion, maybe. Desperation. The accidental mercy of a man who had run out of the energy required to say no. But that was the thing about the right decision. It didn't always announce itself as important. Sometimes it just appeared in a cold October morning on a failing ranch, as a woman at the gate asking for honest work. And you either opened the gate or you didn't. And what happened next was entirely determined by that one small hinge of a moment. He had opened the gate. He had no idea what he was doing. That was probably the most honest thing about the whole story. That the best decision he ever made was made without complete information, without certainty, without any particular wisdom beyond the tired recognition that he had nothing left to protect and therefore nothing to lose by letting someone in. He thought Edwin Rowan might have understood that in the end. Hard as he was, practical as he was, he had also built something that was still standing, still being lived in, still producing, still feeding people. 1 year after his death, 1 year after it had nearly come apart, 1 year into something that was neither Edwin's ranch nor something entirely different, but was the next thing, the continued thing, the thing that kept going because the people in it decided it would. "The Mercer family is welcome to stay as long as they'd like," Garrett said. Abigail looked at him. "The Rowan family," she said. He looked at her. She looked back, steady and gray-eyed and direct, and not performing any particular emotion but containing all of them somewhere under the surface, the way she contained most things, managed, present, and very much her own. "The Rowan family," he said. The sun finished setting over the plains and the first stars came up, and the house behind them was lit and warm and full of the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening. A family in a house that had decided, against some odds and with significant effort and no small amount of stubbornness on multiple fronts, to be a home. It was not a perfect place. It was not a perfect family, not a perfect marriage, not a perfect life by any measure that requires the absence of difficulty or the presence of ease. But it was real, and it was theirs, and every person in it had chosen it, had kept choosing it, daily, the way you choose anything that matters, which is not once and forever but again and again, through the cold mornings and the hard numbers and the people who ride up to the gate with claims on what you've built, through all of it, again and again, until the choosing itself becomes the thing you're made of. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.